Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. The alarm clock's shrill buzz sliced through the silence of the room, dragging John Archer from the suffocating grip of sleep. It was 7 a.m., a typical weekday. He reached over, fumbling in the half-darkness to slap the snooze button. The cold plastic of the clock's frame felt strangely familiar, even though he had only bought it a few months ago. It had been one of those impulse buys at the store, one of those things that made him feel like an adult, as if the act of buying a real alarm clock meant something, like it meant he was making progress in life. He stretched and yawned, his bones creaking like old wood, a reminder of the years stacking up behind him. The bed felt like it always did, soft but slightly too warm. The weight of the blanket pressing down on him felt like it had been there for years, suffocating and familiar. The room was dim, the curtains still drawn tight, and the slanted light filtering through the edges of the blinds was the kind of morning light that made everything look slightly unreal. The edges of the dresser and the nightstand were softened in that particular light, like they were slightly out of focus, as if someone had been playing with the lens of reality. John swung his legs out of bed and stood, feeling the soft carpet beneath his bare feet. His body was still heavy with the sleep he hadn't quite shaken off, but the day was waiting, as it always did. The smell of coffee brewing downstairs wafted up the stairs. It was always there, always the same, a reminder that life, in all its messy, unremarkable glory, always followed the same routine. He dragged himself into the bathroom, barely looking in the mirror. It was one of those mornings where everything felt off, but he couldn't put a finger on it. Was it the sleepiness, or was it just another one of those days when the weight of everything started pressing down, slowly at first, then harder with each hour? The kind of day where nothing feels right, even if everything looks the same. The faucet creaked as it turned on, the cold water running down over his hands. The chill of it hit his skin like a slap, and he let out a small gasp, waking himself up a little more. He didn't bother to look at the clock this time. It was always the same, always 7:15 a.m. when he brushed his teeth, the cold mint of the toothpaste in his mouth, the slight burn of the bristles against his gums. Routine, 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 routine. But there was something different this time. Something subtle that tugged at the edges of his mind. Something just off. The mirror in front of him seemed to flicker, like a bulb struggling to stay on. His reflection didn't seem quite right. It was him. Of course it was. But it felt distant, like looking at a stranger. The face staring back was familiar, but somehow hollow. His eyes looked tired, deeper than usual, the circles beneath them darker. He hadn't noticed it before, but now that it was pointed out, it seemed impossible to ignore. A sudden chill brushed the back of his neck, like fingers from the dark reaching out to touch him. He froze, the toothbrush halfway to his mouth. His gaze darted to the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. The hallway outside was as silent as it ever was. No creaks, no whispers, just the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his chest. Just nerves, he muttered to himself. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. It wasn't nerves. Something had shifted. He couldn't tell what exactly, but the feeling sat heavy in the pit of his stomach, like the calm before a storm. The toothbrush finished its routine, the paste spitting into the sink as he rinsed his mouth, and the mirror went back to normal, clear, bright, reflecting the same tired face. The strange moment was gone, slipping away like a dream once it was remembered. He left the bathroom and walked downstairs, the smell of coffee growing stronger with every step. The kitchen was small, just a tiny corner of the house. A worn table, 2 chairs, the counter cluttered with the remnants of a life lived without much fanfare. He pulled the coffee mug from the cupboard and filled it with the dark brew, the hot liquid sliding down his throat like liquid warmth, the bitterness of it waking him up fully. It felt good, normal, even. It should have felt comforting, but for some reason, it didn't. He could almost hear the ticking of a clock in the background, louder than usual. Each tick felt like a countdown, like time was moving too quickly for him to catch up. But when he glanced at the wall clock, it was still the same, 7:30 a.m. It was funny how the morning could seem to drag on forever, and yet be over in the blink of an eye. It was funny how his feet could move without thinking, carrying him through the same old motions. Coffee, check. Breakfast, check. Brush hair, check. Put on shoes, check. But that nagging feeling followed him like a shadow. The front door creaked as he stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting his face like a slap. It was a quiet street, as it always was. The same houses, the same cars parked in the driveways, the same birds singing from the trees, the same mundane details that defined his life, that proved he was, in some way, still connected to the world around him. But the street felt wrong. The edges of things felt blurry, as if someone had drawn over reality with a dull pencil. It was as if the world had been slightly shifted, pulled out of focus in a way that made everything seem too sharp, too unnatural. The trees swayed in the breeze, but the leaves were still, unmoving, as if frozen in place. The mailbox at the end of the driveway rattled, though there was no wind. The sound was wrong, like metal on metal, the rattling too harsh. He blinked and shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind, trying to banish the unease gnawing at him. There was no reason for any of this. The world was fine. It was just another day, just another normal, routine morning. He'd get in his car, drive to work, go through the motions. He always did. It would be fine. But when he turned back to the house, it was as if something was watching him, something waiting just beyond the front door. It was that strange feeling again, like the world was holding its breath. The house felt alive in a way that unsettled him. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a presence, like a weight on his chest. He shook his head again, hard this time. Number it was just a trick of the mind. It was early, and he was tired. Maybe he just needed more sleep. Maybe that was all it was. But as he climbed into the car and started the engine, the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with him like a dark cloud, pressing in from every side. It was in the hum of the tires on the asphalt. It was in the way the streetlights blinked on and off, like something was trying to tell him something. And as he pulled out of the driveway, He heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking shut behind him, a small, fleeting sound that echoed far too loudly in his mind. The engine hummed beneath John Archer's fingertips as he steered the car down the winding suburban streets. The strange feeling that had been clawing at him, the gnawing, insistent sensation of something wrong, still hadn't lifted. If anything, it was growing stronger, taking root in the pit of his stomach, deep down where it turned and churned like something dark and wriggling. He glanced at the dashboard clock as he made the left onto Willow Drive. 7:45 a.m. It didn't feel right. His brain was telling him that something was off, but he couldn't quite place it. The morning had unfolded as it always did. The same routine, same cup of coffee, same toast, same quiet house. Even the drive to work had felt routine, yet everything had seemed slightly different. Not enough to be noticed at first, but enough that it clung to him, like an unwanted thought. John shook his head, trying to clear the fog. Maybe he just needed to shake off the stress. Maybe his body was craving something. Sleep, maybe, or a break from work. But then his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, and for a second, he swore he saw a figure standing in the rear of the car, shadowed and still. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. It's just the light, just a trick of the mirror, he thought, but his pulse quickened. He glanced in the rear view again. Nothing. Just the empty road behind him, stretching out like a ribbon of gray. Just nerves. He exhaled slowly and forced his eyes back to the road, but the uneasy feeling didn't let go. Not this time. This time, it felt more like a presence, like he was being watched, not just from behind him, but from everywhere. He made the usual turn into the parking lot of his office building. The same cracked pavement, the same handful of cars parked around the edges. Nothing was unusual, not really. The morning workers were arriving, chatting casually as they crossed the lot. They waved, and he returned a distracted half wave. But even that felt wrong. It was as though the world was pressing in on him from all sides, like the walls of reality were constricting, shifting just a little with every passing second. He parked his car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the sharp, cool air. It smelled clean, like it always did, but there was a strange undertone to it today. Something metallic. Maybe it was the air conditioning in the building, or the chemicals in the parking lot. He didn't know, but he didn't like it. He walked inside the building, the echo of his shoes on the linoleum floor strangely loud. As he passed the usual receptionist's desk, the woman, Claire, looked up from her phone. Her smile was wide, but too wide, forced, as if it had been practiced. "Good morning, John," she called out, her voice too cheery. "Looks like it's going to be another beautiful day." He nodded, smiling back, but the expression felt hollow. "Yeah, sure," he replied, the words tasting wrong in his mouth. Another beautiful day. That was it. It wasn't just that the words themselves felt strange. It was the delivery. Claire's eyes flickered over to something else, as if she wasn't really seeing him. John's smile faded, and he moved past her quickly, his feet carrying him toward the elevator. The hallway stretched out in front of him, sterile and clinical, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He tried to focus on something, anything, to break the growing sense of unease, but the sharp sound of his footsteps against the hard tile seemed unnaturally loud. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside. It was the same old elevator, just as unremarkable as the rest of the building. The floor numbers lit up one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then stopped at 5, the button he pressed for his office floor. The doors closed behind him, the soft hum of the elevator filling the air. Then something happened. The elevator didn't move. John blinked, his hand still resting on the shiny brass button for floor 5. The faint smell of stale air hung in the elevator, the hum growing louder, more ominous, as if the air itself was heavy with the weight of something unsaid. He pressed the button again, harder this time. Nothing. He pressed it repeatedly, waiting for the familiar upward lurch of the lift. Still, nothing. He stepped back, eyes wide now, and glanced at the numbers above the doors. They were flickering, blinking erratically like a dying light bulb. He squinted at them, confusion creeping up his spine. The numbers shifted and warped before his eyes, the sequence changing from 5 to 6, then 7, then back to 3, and then a number he couldn't quite read. He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, but it didn't open. The door stayed stubbornly shut. He pressed the emergency button, and the light blinked, once, twice, and then shut off completely. What the hell is going on? The elevator was still. No movement, no sound. Only the strange, oppressive silence that hung around him. His heart raced in his chest, his palms growing slick against the cold metal railing. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and then the elevator lurched. It was the suddenness of it that got to him. The way the movement was unnatural, wrong. The elevator shot upward too quickly, as though the cables had snapped, and it was free-falling. His stomach dropped into his throat, and he clutched the railing, trying to steady himself. It stopped just as abruptly as it had started, and he was thrown back against the wall. The doors opened. He didn't know why, but he didn't step out immediately. Instead, he stood there, frozen, staring at the empty hallway that awaited him. It was just as he remembered. Familiar. Safe. But everything felt distorted. The air, heavy and stale. The floor, just a little too slick. And the silence. It was as though the world had paused for a brief second, holding its breath, waiting for something. The sound of footsteps came from behind him, sharp and measured. They echoed down the hallway like the ticking of a clock. John turned around. It was Claire again, but this time her expression was even stranger. The smile was gone, replaced by something cold, empty. "John," she said in a low voice, her eyes fixed on him, unblinking. "Are you feeling all right?" John's breath caught in his throat. Her face didn't change. Her voice didn't change. But there was something off in the way she spoke, like she knew something he didn't. "Yeah," he managed, his throat dry. "I'm fine. Just a little tired, I guess." Claire nodded slowly, her head tilting in a way that made John feel like she was studying him. "You should be careful today," she said softly, too softly. "It's important that you follow the routine. Everything must go exactly as planned. Understand?" He blinked. "What do you mean? What?" Before he could finish, she turned away and walked down the hall, her footsteps echoing off the walls, and John stood there, still as a statue, the echo of her warning ringing in his ears. John stood frozen in the hallway, eerie echo of Claire's footsteps reverberating in his chest. His mind raced, still tangled in confusion and dread. What the hell was that? He thought. What did she mean by follow the routine? His gaze snapped back to the elevator. The doors were still open, as if inviting him back in. but he couldn't bring himself to enter. The air around him felt thick, pressing against him from all sides. Something was wrong. Something fundamental was unraveling, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was like the world around him had become slippery, as if reality itself was starting to peel away, exposing something darker underneath. He turned back toward his office, moving mechanically, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. But even as he walked, his mind kept replaying Claire's last words. Follow the routine. The phrase repeated in his head like a mantra, and each time it did, the weight in his chest seemed to grow heavier. At his desk, the blinking cursor on his computer screen greeted him, still and indifferent. He sat down, feeling the weight of his body sink into the chair, but his eyes remained fixed on the monitor. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, more insistent, vibrating in his teeth. The seconds passed, the minutes stretched, but it felt like the world outside the office had somehow slowed down. He opened his email, the bright screen glowing back at him like a mocking eye. The inbox was full of unread messages, just as it always was, but there was one at the top, marked urgent. The subject line was short, cryptic. Are you awake? A chill ran down his spine. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and despite himself, he clicked on the message. The email opened, and the words were brief but chilling. John, you're starting to notice, aren't you? The loops, the shifts, the things that don't quite match. You have to keep going, no matter what. Follow the routine. Don't let them see that you see. Trust no one, not even Claire. John's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall, 9:15 a.m. He had only just gotten to work. The message suggested he already knew something was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, the back of his neck prickling with cold sweat. Was this a prank? Some sick joke? But who could have known what Claire had said? Who could have known the feeling that had been gnawing at him all morning, growing like an infection in his chest? The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway again, soft but approaching, and for a split second, John's heart skipped. He turned, but the hallway outside was empty, just like it had been for the past few minutes. No one was there, just nerves. He tried to tell himself again, but it didn't sit right. He hadn't imagined the footsteps. He knew what he had heard, and now for some reason, the silence that followed was far worse than any noise. He exhaled sharply and turned back to the screen, but his eyes wouldn't focus on anything. He couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching him. It was like his peripheral vision was playing tricks on him, shapes moving in the corners of his sight. But when he looked directly at them, there was nothing. Just the flickering, mind-numbing monotony of the office, the beige walls, the stacks of paperwork, the endless hum of technology, all blending into the gray haze that felt thicker than the air around him. Then there was a knock at the door. John's heart leaped into his throat. His pulse quickened as the handle turned slowly. It was too early for his co-workers to drop by. He hadn't even started his first task for the day, and there was no reason anyone would be visiting. No reason at all. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the light from the hallway. For a brief moment, John could only see the outline of them, the shadow stretching long across the floor. The figure was tall, cloaked in the soft shadow of the corridor. His eyes narrowed, scanning, and then the figure stepped into the light. It was Caleb, a colleague, but something was wrong. His smile, for one thing. It was too wide, too eager, as if his face had been stretched. His eyes were wide, but not in excitement, in panic. There was a sharp, frenzied edge to him, as if he'd been running, desperate for breath. "Hey, John," Caleb said, his voice oddly strained. "Everything okay?" John's mouth went dry. "Yeah, just a little tired," he said, forcing the words out. "What's up?" Caleb stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation. He looked like he was about to say something more, but he stopped short, glancing nervously at the empty chair across from John's desk. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something that wasn't there. John felt the unease in his chest deepen. "This is ridiculous," he thought. "It's just Caleb. You've worked with him for years." But the way Caleb was acting, like he was waiting for something, like he was worried about being seen, it set John's nerves on edge. And then there was that smile, the wrongness of it. You don't hear them?" Caleb asked suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. John blinked. "What?" "The footsteps," Caleb said quickly. "They're coming. You hear them, don't you?" John's eyes widened, his heart slamming against his ribs. Footsteps? Caleb was still scanning the office, his body taut, like he was waiting for someone, or something, to jump out of the walls. "What are you talking about?" John asked, his voice trembling despite himself. Caleb's gaze snapped back to him, his pupils wide and black. "I've tried, John. I've tried everything. But it's like the world is stuck on a loop. We're stuck. They're watching. They know what we're doing. They know what we see." John's breath hitched in his throat. Caleb's voice was rising in pitch, panicked now, almost frantic. "You're here," Caleb shouted, his voice cracking. "Don't let them see. Don't let them." Before John could respond, Caleb's words were abruptly put off by a loud, bone-rattling crack. The ceiling above them groaned, and the lights flickered once again, twice, then 3 times, before they went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. John's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. He reached for the desk lamp, fumbling with the switch, but it wouldn't turn on. His hand shot out in the dark, finding nothing but empty space. And then, as if responding to Caleb's warning, footsteps began. Software slow, too deliberate. They echoed in the hallway, closer now, closer than they should have been. John's body froze in place, and then, from the darkness, Caleb screamed. The darkness hung in the room, like a suffocating blanket, thick and heavy, pressing in on John Archer. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he fumbled for something, anything to break the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything in the room. His fingers brushed the edge of his desk, his eyes still straining against the pitch-black void around him. Then he heard it, the thing he had feared all along, a soft, unmistakable sound, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that echoed through the room as though they were walking in time with his heartbeat. His throat tightened, his pulse quickened, but still the footsteps came, slow, measured, like someone was waiting for the right moment, waiting for him, Caleb. He needed to find Caleb. He needed to get out of this nightmare of an office. But where was Caleb? He had screamed, a horrified shriek that echoed in John's mind, and then, nothing. Silence. The footsteps grew louder. The darkness seemed to grow deeper. Every sound, every scrape, every rustling made his mind reel. He could feel them drawing nearer, the presence in the room thickening with every second. "Caleb," John croaked, his voice barely a whisper. He hated how weak it sounded, how tremulous. No answer. His hand shook as he reached out again, desperate to find something to steady him. His fingers brushed over the cool surface of the desk again, then slid toward the edge of a drawer. The drawer creaked open with a low metallic groan, and his fingers closed around the nearest object, a pen, a cheap plastic thing that felt utterly useless in his hand. Footsteps were so close now that he could almost hear the shuffling of fabric, the creaking of shoes on the linoleum floor. His skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. But it wasn't just that. There was something more, something wrong with the air itself. His hand froze mid-reach. He wasn't alone. John's spine stiffened, his heart pounding so violently it felt like it would rip out of his chest. The air shifted again, thickening, closing in. His breath was shallow, trapped inside his own lungs as he slowly, ever so slowly, turned his head toward the source of the footsteps. And there, standing in the doorway, was Caleb. Or at least, it looked like Caleb. But something was wrong. His face, his expression was blank, empty. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed directly on John. But they weren't the same eyes. Those eyes, the ones that had once been warm and filled with nervous energy, were now cold, empty, almost hollow. The figure stood there, unmoving, watching. The sound of Caleb's breath, labored and ragged, echoed around John's skull. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't move. He didn't speak. John's voice, hoarse and unsteady, broke the silence. "Caleb, what happened to you?" No response. It wasn't Caleb. John knew that now. Whatever had stood there, whatever was standing there, wasn't Caleb. Not anymore. It wore his body. It mimicked his features, but it wasn't him. Not in any real sense. It was something else. Something far darker. And then the voice, Caleb's voice, came. But it wasn't Caleb's voice. It was deeper, stretched out like it was being dragged over a gravel road. "John," it rasped. The voice cracked in places, like an old record skipping. "You shouldn't have listened. You shouldn't have seen." John's stomach turned over as the words hung in the air, thick with malice. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure in the doorway, despite every instinct telling him to run. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "What the hell are you talking about? What's going on?" The thing that used to be Caleb tilted its head, the motion stiff and unnatural. Its lips twisted into a grin, but it wasn't a grin of amusement. It was something far more sinister, like a trap being set. "The loop, John," it whispered, and the words seemed to echo, ringing through the room. "The loop. It doesn't stop. It never stops. You can't break free, no matter what you do. You're all just pieces in the game." John's breath hitched, his mind reeling. Pieces in the game? He wanted to speak, to protest, to demand answers, but his throat was dry. The words didn't come. The creature before him, Caleb's body, but not Caleb, took another step forward, moving with unnerving slowness. Its feet dragged on the floor, dragging behind it, as though the very act of walking was exhausting it. "You're not the first," it rasped, its voice cracking again. "You won't be the last." John stepped backward, his feet stumbling against the edge of his desk. His body screamed for him to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He couldn't run, not yet. Not while this thing stood in front of him, taunting him. "What do you want from me?" His voice was barely more than a breath. The thing's grin widened, showing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged, like they didn't belong in a human mouth. "I want you to remember," it said, and John felt the weight of the words sink into his chest. "I want you to remember what happens next." John's head spun. What happened next? What happens next? He stumbled back again, his heart hammering in his chest, but the thing didn't move. Instead, it let out a sharp laugh, a high-pitched, wheezing laugh that felt like nails scraping against his skull. And in that moment, the lights above him flickered again, this time more violently, casting harsh shadows across the room. "Do you hear it?" the thing asked, its voice lowering. "Do you hear them? The footsteps? It's all part of it. It's all part of the loop." John's blood ran cold. The footsteps. The sound was growing, louder, closer, almost deafening. It was coming from all sides now, all at once, like 1,000 different people walking toward him, closing in from every direction. But they weren't coming from the hallway. No, the footsteps were inside his head now. His hands went to his ears, pressing hard against the pounding noise. It was overwhelming, a wave of sound that was far too real, far too alive. He could feel his sanity unraveling, thread by thread, as the noise clawed at his brain. And then, as if to seal his fate, the creature, Caleb, or whatever it was, spoke again, this time with a quiet certainty. "The last night is coming, John. The last night." John's breath caught in his throat. His eyes flew wide with realization. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" But the thing didn't answer. Instead, it let out one last, haunting chuckle before the darkness swallowed it whole and the footsteps began to fade. But John knew that they weren't fading at all. They were coming. Coming for him. The room was silent again. And in that silence, John Archer could hear only his ragged breathing, each inhale and exhale, jagged and sharp like broken glass. His pulse was thudding in his ears now, a drumbeat that was impossibly loud. His mind was reeling, swirling in a whirlpool of dread, trying desperately to process what had just happened. What was real? What was an illusion? The last night. The words echoed in his mind like an unstoppable mantra, a sound that burrowed deep into the marrow of his bones. The footsteps were gone for now, but they had left behind something much worse. The certainty that John wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. Whatever had been lurking at the edges of his perception was now front and center, standing in the very room with him, in the very walls. Walls that were slowly, deliberately closing in. The air felt thick, suffocating. He could feel it against his skin, the weight of something pressing down on him, crushing him in ways he couldn't begin to describe. And then, as he stood there, frozen to the spot, something happened. The lights flickered, a sharp, violent flash of brightness that nearly blinded him, followed by a deep, unsettling darkness. John flinched, his heart leaping into his throat, but the darkness didn't last. Instead, it faded, a slow, crawling fade that stretched the seconds into something endless. When the lights flickered back on, the room had changed. It wasn't his office anymore. The walls were darker, the colors faded. Everything was wrong. The shadows were deeper, longer. The floor, once so clean and orderly, was now cracked and dirty, stained with something he didn't want to identify. The desk, his desk, was still there, but it looked warped, distorted, like it had been part of a nightmare. A heavy sigh left his lips, an involuntary exhalation as the world around him twisted further. He stepped forward, the sound of his footsteps so loud in the eerie silence that it felt like an intrusion. The office stretched before him in an endless loop of disorientation. He didn't know if he could trust anything anymore. The loop, he thought. The loop is breaking. But as he took another step, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet reached his ears. John's body went rigid. The same footsteps, the same dragging, slow footsteps, echoed once more. This time, they were different. The sound wasn't distant, fading into the background like before. It was here. It was close. Too close. He turned toward the source of the sound, and he wasn't prepared for what he saw. The figure stood in the doorway. It was Caleb, or at least it looked like Caleb. But this version of Caleb was different, twisted. His skin was pale, almost deathly so, and his eyes, those wide, panicked eyes, were now glazed over, like they were filled with nothing but dark, empty voids. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. He reached toward John with an outstretched hand, but his fingers were unnaturally long, and they curled with a disturbing, fluid motion that didn't belong to a human body. John felt a tremor of pure terror shoot up his spine, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away. And then, with that same unnatural slowness, Caleb stepped into the room. The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed like thunder, reverberating through the room and rattling John's teeth. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. "This is it," Caleb's voice came at last. But it wasn't Caleb's voice. Not really. It was deeper, like the voice of something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. John's breath caught. "What do you mean, this is it?" he demanded, trying to summon some semblance of control. But his voice faltered as soon as the words left his mouth. He felt like he was drowning. "The inn," the figure rasped. "The last night, John. The night that doesn't end." John's heart raced, his eyes wide with terror. No, this isn't real. It can't be. I'm trapped. This has to be some mistake." The figure that was Caleb took a step forward, and the floor beneath him creaked, the sound so loud and sharp that it made John flinch. The air in the room grew thick again, like something was choking it, suffocating it. And then Caleb, or whatever had replaced him, smiled. It wasn't a smile. It was a thing of pure malice, an expression that had no place in a human face. The mouth stretched too wide, lips pulling back until John thought they would tear. The teeth were too sharp, too jagged. John couldn't look away, couldn't tear his eyes from the creature in front of him, even as the room seemed to shift again, the walls narrowing, the shadows creeping in from all sides. He could hear the soft whisper of the loop beginning again. "I won't let you break free, John," the figure said, its voice slithering like a snake. "You're part of the game. You're just one more piece, one more cog in the wheel, and there's no escape." John backed up until he hit the wall. His chest was tight, his breath coming in short bursts, but the room, the space around him, seemed to close in. The walls felt like they were pressing in on him, slowly, relentlessly. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, but it wasn't enough to drown out the horrible sound of the footsteps getting closer. They weren't just the sound of someone moving through the hallway anymore. They were the sound of the world itself collapsing. The loop was tightening around him. The creature in front of him, Caleb, or whatever it was, didn't move. It didn't have to. The terror was already there, crawling under his skin, scratching at his nerves. "You're still not awake," Caleb's figure murmured, and the words were an iron hook, sinking deeper. "You'll never wake up. It's always the same night, John. Over and over again. You'll live it forever." The words echoed in John's skull, louder and louder, until they were all he could hear. He could feel the weight of the loop bearing down on him, crushing him from all sides. The creature stepped closer, its breath hot on his skin, its face warped into something unrecognizable. But John wasn't afraid of the creature anymore. Not of the thing wearing Caleb's face. What terrified him most now was the realization that it was all true. He was trapped, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break free. It wasn't just a loop. It was a cage. The last night, the night that never ended, was finally here, and it would be his forever. The house was everything Lena and David had dreamed of. Nestled on the outskirts of a small town, it had that perfect blend of old charm and modern amenities. A wide porch that wrapped around the front, a cozy fireplace that had been restored to its former glory, and most importantly, the garden. The garden was the crown jewel, a sprawling patch of green that seemed to stretch on forever, with vibrant flowers, neatly trimmed hedges, and old oak trees that stood sentinel in the corners. It was idyllic, a place out of a dream, or a painting, if you were being poetic about it. Lena, an artist, had always wanted a space like this to create, to paint, to live, and David, with his quiet, practical nature, had always longed for a retreat, a place to escape from the grind of city life. They'd both worked hard for years in the corporate world, and this was the culmination of their effort. This house, this garden, it was supposed to be the beginning of something new. The first few weeks were perfect. They unpacked boxes, set up the furniture, and sat in the living room, watching the evening sun dip behind the treetops. The air smelled like fresh earth and rain, like something alive. It was the kind of place that made you feel as though the world had slowed down a little. But there was something off about the garden. It wasn't obvious at first, nothing overt or alarming, just a small corner of it, tucked away in the back, near the edge of the yard, where the old iron fence was slightly bent. That corner, the one that should have been bursting with color, was strangely still. It wasn't that the plants there were dead, not exactly. No, they were very much alive, in a way, but they had a rotting quality to them, something that couldn't be ignored once you saw it. The roses, normally a brilliant shade of red, were dull and sickly looking, their petals curling in on themselves, like something that had been left out in the sun for too long. The lavender, usually a soothing purple, was a dark, sickly brown at the edges. Vines twisted around the broken fence, and the air around them seemed to carry a strange scent, a musty, earthy stench that reminded Lena of something decayed. David, ever the skeptic, didn't pay it much mind at first. It's just an old patch of garden, probably hasn't been tended to in a while, he said, brushing it off with the same practical tone he always used when Lena got fixated on something. "We'll get to it later, honey. Right now, let's just enjoy the rest of the place." But Lena couldn't shake the feeling. She found herself walking past that corner of the garden every day, her eyes drawn to it, as if the plants were calling to her. It wasn't just the decay. It was the way they seemed to move, imperceptibly, in the windless air, like they were alive, reaching, One afternoon, after weeks of putting it off, Lena couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed the garden tools from the shed and marched toward that corner, determined to clear it out. David had gone into town to run some errands, and for the first time, Lena was alone with the garden. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something unnatural. She knelt down by the overgrown plants, feeling the strange, wet soil under her fingertips. There was something off about it. The ground felt spongy, almost like it was too soft, as though it were rotting from below. She started pulling up weeds, her hands trembling slightly, but then she froze. Beneath the earth, there was something else, something hard. Of a tree. She dug a little deeper, her hands growing dirtier, until she uncovered a mass of roots, tangled together, pulsing in time with something she couldn't quite place. The roots were massive, dark, and unnatural in their shape. They twisted and coiled, thick as cables, sprawling out in every direction beneath the soil, their tendrils reaching like fingers, grasping for something. Lena's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she felt a pulse of panic, but she shook it off. It had to be an old tree root system. That's all it could be, but it didn't feel like a tree. The ground around the roots seemed to shift, like the earth itself was breathing. The roots, once stationary, began to twitch, ever so slightly, as though responding to her touch. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Something wasn't right. She didn't know what, but she felt it in her bones. Just then, she heard David's voice from the distance, calling her name. The sound was like a lifeline, a tether pulling her back to reality. She stood up quickly, brushing the dirt from her hands, and forced herself to breathe. "Lena." David's voice came again, this time louder. She stood there for a moment longer, eyes still fixed on the corner of the garden. The roots were still there, twitching beneath the soil, and now they seemed to be growing thicker, pushing their way out from the earth. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around, looking for any sign of a breeze or wind, but everything was still, too still. "Lena," David called again, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Lena turned away from the garden and made her way back to the house. Her heart was still racing, but she tried to calm herself. It was just the overgrowth. She was imagining things, that's all. She'd had a stressful week, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she stepped inside the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something had noticed her. And the garden, whatever was in that corner, wasn't finished with her yet. David came in, his arms full of groceries. "What did you find out there?" he asked, half joking. He set the bags down on the kitchen counter and glanced at her. "You look like you saw a ghost." Lena forced a laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I think I did," she said softly, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Not now, not ever since she'd touched the roots. That night, as she lay in bed, the darkness seemed thicker, heavier, pressing down on her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but the image of the garden kept flashing in her mind. The way the roots moved, the way the earth had felt beneath her hands. There was something wrong with that garden, something ancient, something alive. And then she heard it, a low slithering sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It came from outside, from the garden. It sounded like something crawling through the earth. Her heart raced as she held her breath. It's just the wind, she told herself. Just the wind. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something in the garden was stirring. The days that followed seemed like a blur. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something had been awakened. Something ancient, deep beneath the soil of that garden. She tried to push it from her mind, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But the unease never fully left her. It followed her through the house, into the kitchen, the living room, and even as she sat in the studio with her paints and brushes, the nagging sensation that something was wrong tugged at her. And the worst part was, David didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it. He went about his business as usual, tending to small repairs around the house, chatting about his work, always with that same relaxed demeanor. Everything seemed normal to him, too normal, as if nothing had changed. But Lena felt it, that presence, the thing waiting, watching. One morning, after a restless night, where the slithering sound outside had seemed so much louder than before, Lena decided to go back to the garden. She'd already pushed aside the unease for too long. If she didn't find out what was wrong with that corner of the yard, she was certain it would drive her mad. David was out, likely in town picking up more supplies. She had the house to herself, and for the first time, she was alone with the garden. The moment she stepped outside, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, as if it had been filtered through some unseen fog. She turned toward the back of the yard, the familiar garden stretching out in front of her. The well-maintained beds of flowers, the neat hedges, the soft hum of bees in the distance, all of it was there. But the corner, the one she had been avoiding, felt like a dark, suffocating place now. The closer she got, the more her skin prickled, as if the garden itself was a living thing, watching her. The rotting plants had grown again. The vines, once scattered and sparse, now stretched further, creeping over the edges of the fence like hands reaching out from the soil. The air smelled rancid, that sickly sweet stench of decay, mixed with something worse, something alive. Lena knelt down by the overgrown patch, her hands shaking as she gripped the soil. The dirt was cold now, colder than it had been before. She dug her fingers into it, heart hammering in her chest, pushing aside the loose topsoil to get at the roots beneath, the same ones she had seen days ago, twitching as if they were waiting for her. But this time, there was something different. The earth itself seemed to pulse beneath her touch, almost like it was breathing. A low, guttural sound rippled up from the ground, like something awakening. It was a vibration in her bones, like an echo from the depths of the earth. The ground shuddered beneath her fingertips. She recoiled, pulling her hand away. A deep crack split the soil, running along the edge of the garden like a wound opening. The sound was sharp, jagged, almost like the snapping of old bones. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she stood, eyes locked on the jagged split in the earth. And then, slowly, the earth moved. The roots beneath the soil began to writhe and coil, stretching further out from the ground, the tendrils pulsing, reaching like serpents in search of something. She took a step back, heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced for an explanation, anything that could explain what was happening. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, thumping louder, faster. David! Her voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. She glanced toward the house, but David wasn't back yet. She was alone alone with whatever was happening beneath the garden. The vines twitched, and before Lena could stop herself, she found herself crouching down again, her hands pressed against the soft earth. She felt it, the sensation, the pulse, the heartbeat. It was coming from the roots, from deep below. It wasn't just the movement of plants. It wasn't just the natural growth of vegetation. There was something alive down there, something older than the house, older than the land itself, something hungry. Her hands were trembling as she reached deeper into the soil, pulling away dirt, her fingernails digging into the earth. She gasped when her fingers made contact with something hard, something that wasn't just a root. It was slick, smooth, and cold, like bone or stone. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the strange texture, the impossibly smooth surface. And then she heard it. A faint, distant whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, like wind passing through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low and insistent, whispering from beneath the ground. "Help me," it said. Lena froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't move. She didn't dare breathe. The voice was so close, so familiar, like a memory she couldn't place. It was like someone was speaking directly into her mind, a voice she had heard before, but where? Before she could process the thought, the roots suddenly jerked. A violent tug, as though they were alive, as though the soil had a mind of its own. Her fingers slipped from the surface of the smooth object beneath the earth, and she fell backward, landing hard on the grass. A dry, wheezing sound followed, a hiss. It was the earth itself, as though it were trying to speak. The roots began to slither, their movement unnaturally fast, like snakes finding prey. Lena scrambled backward, panic seizing her chest. She had to get away from the garden. She had to, and then, as if mocking her, the garden stopped. The vines froze in place. The crack in the earth closed. The pulsating sensation beneath the soil died away. It was as though everything had been an illusion, a terrible trick played on her mind. The garden was still again. Lena stood, her heart racing, her hands trembling as she wiped the dirt from her palms. She didn't know what to make of it. Had it been real? Had it been her imagination? But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew it had been real. Something had moved. Something had tried to crawl its way out from beneath the soil. She didn't wait for David. She ran inside, bolting the door behind her, as if the garden might follow her into the house. The house was still, too still. Lena's mind was a whirlwind, filled with the whispering voice, the sensation of something ancient, something pulsing beneath her feet. The garden wasn't just a garden. It was something else, something old, something that had been waiting, and it was getting closer. That night, Lena didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind raced, spinning around the images of what she had seen in the garden, what she had felt, the pulse beneath the soil, the whispering voice that came from the deep, dark places of the earth. It was something she had read about in novels, heard in stories, the ancient horrors that lurked beneath the surface of the world, waiting. But those were just stories, weren't they? Yet she knew, in her bones, that what she had experienced was real, far too real. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, pretend it was just her mind playing tricks on her, she couldn't. The unease, the gnawing dread, had settled deep inside her. It wouldn't leave. It couldn't. David had come home later, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. He'd asked her if she was feeling all right, why she looked so pale, But Lena hadn't been able to answer him. She didn't know how to explain what she had felt, what she had heard coming from beneath the earth, so she had said nothing. She wished she had stayed quiet that night. The next morning, the air was thick with humidity, and the scent of wet soil clung to everything like a cloak. It was early, just before dawn, and Lena stood by the kitchen window, her eyes drawn instinctively to the garden, the corner that had troubled her for so long. The one that had once seemed a mere eyesore was different now. The vines had grown even further, twisting around the old iron fence, creeping toward the other side of the yard. But it wasn't just the size of the plants that disturbed her. It was their movement. They swayed slightly, though there was no wind. It was like they were aware of her watching them, like they were reaching out to her, calling her, and she couldn't stop herself. She grabbed her jacket and went outside. This time, it felt even worse. The moment her feet hit the grass, she could feel the weight of the garden pressing down on her, as if it was aware of her every step, watching her, waiting for her to come closer. The air was thick with that musty, earthy smell, decay mixed with something more pungent, like rotten meat. Her stomach turned, but she ignored it. She made her way to the corner of the garden, her footsteps slow and deliberate, even though every part of her screamed to turn around and run. The ground felt different today. It felt wrong. Lena kneeled down beside the overgrown patch of rotting plants, her hands trembling as she brushed away the top layer of soil. The roots were there as they had been before, massive and sprawling, twisting beneath the surface. But now they were moving, even without her touch. They shifted in the soil, as if searching, reaching for something they couldn't find. And then she saw it. The smooth, bone-like object she had touched before was now exposed, lying just beneath the surface of the soil. It was large, oval-shaped, its surface slick and shiny in the dull morning light. It looked almost like a seed, but there was nothing natural about it. It was a sickly gray color, the texture slick and pulsating, like it was alive. Lena swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She reached out to touch it again, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above it. She shouldn't. Something in her told her not to, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. Her fingers made contact with the cold surface of the object, and the moment they did, the ground beneath her shook violently. The soil trembled, a deep rumble vibrating through the earth, and the roots responded, writhing and twisting, pulling themselves further out from beneath the surface. Lena screamed and pulled her hand back, but the object below her feet moved. It slid through the soil as if it were sliding on a bed of oil. It pulled itself deeper into the earth, dragging the roots with it, as though the earth itself was coming alive. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze stayed locked on the patch of garden. The roots were writhing in every direction now, the entire area alive with movement. The air around her seemed to hum, like 1,000 voices whispering just out of reach. And then she saw it, just beneath the surface of the soil. She saw something else, a shape, something dark and massive, pushing its way upward, something huge. Lena's blood ran cold. She was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as she watched it move. The shape was nearly too large to comprehend, like the shadow of a thing too ancient, too terrible to be real. And then it happened. The soil cracked open. A deep, jagged tear split across the garden, and from the crack, something burst forth. It wasn't a plant. It wasn't a root. It was something much worse. A massive tendril, slick and writhing, shot out of the ground like an obscene worm, its surface covered in strange markings that looked almost like eyes. The tendril reached out toward Lena, but she couldn't move. It moved with horrifying speed, curling around her, pulling her toward the earth, pulling her toward the thing beneath. Lena screamed, her voice raw and desperate, as she tried to pull away, but it was no use. The tendril had wrapped around her wrist, its grip like iron, and she felt herself being dragged down. The earth was opening wide, a black abyss yawning beneath her, and she could feel something alive down there, something ancient, something far older than any of them. And then, with a jolt, it stopped. The tendril froze. The earth fell silent. Lena was left on her knees in the dirt, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The roots, the tendril, everything had gone still. The garden once again was eerily silent. She looked down at her wrist. There, beneath her skin, she could feel the thrum of something pulsing, something trying to push its way inside of her. She jerked her arm away, horrified, but the feeling didn't stop. And as she looked around at the garden, at the patch of earth she had so naively assumed was just an overgrown corner, she realized the truth. This wasn't a garden. It wasn't a collection of plants. It was a trap, and it was feeding. Lena sat motionless in the dirt, her wrist still throbbing with the strange, pulsing sensation that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. The garden, that once peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a living nightmare, a suffocating presence that hung in the air like a dark cloud. It was as though the very soil was watching her, waiting for her next move, testing her will. The tendril had retracted. The earth had settled once again, but Lena could still feel its unnatural energy thrumming beneath the surface. She shuddered, her hand pressed against the earth, the coldness of it seeping into her skin. Something inside her screamed at her to run, to get away from this place, but she didn't move. Not yet. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What was it that she had touched in the ground? That thing, that object. Was it some kind of seed or something more? Why had the earth reacted so violently? The roots, the voice, the pulse. She could still hear it in her head, like a distant whisper. Help me. She was on the edge of something. She could feel it. The garden, that patch of earth, was not just a garden. It was a doorway, a threshold to something that had been buried long ago. Something that was now waking up. Lena? The voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. David. She flinched, as though caught doing something forbidden. But then, the voice brought a strange sense of comfort. At least it was real. At least it was familiar. Lena, what the hell are you doing? David's voice grew louder, concerned, as he came around the corner of the house, his footsteps crunching over the gravel. Lena couldn't look at him. She couldn't even speak. She simply turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short gasps, as though she had just run a marathon. David knelt beside her, his hand touching her shoulder, grounding her, pulling her back from the edge. Hey, are you okay? Lena's lips parted, but nothing came out at first. The words, the explanations, were all jumbled in her mind, impossible to say. How could she tell him about the whispering voice, the thing beneath the soil, that her own wrist felt as though it had been marked by something ancient, something far older than this house, this garden, or even this town. How could she make him believe her? I don't know what's happening, David, Lena whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible. There's something in the garden, something alive. I touched it, and it's not like anything I've ever seen. David's brow furrowed. He looked over his shoulder toward the garden, his gaze narrowing. His eyes flicked back to Lena, trying to read her, to understand. Lena, it's just a garden. It's been overgrown for years. There's nothing in it except some old plants and roots. No, you don't understand. She shook her head frantically, her fingers trembling as she pointed toward the corner of the garden. It's not just plants. The earth, it's moving. The roots are alive. David's face softened, and for a moment, Lena thought he might just brush it off as another one of her paranoid episodes. But he didn't. Instead, he stood and without a word, walked toward the garden. Lena felt a cold shiver creep up her spine as she watched him. Every part of her wanted to stop him, to warn him, but the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't even tell him what was really happening. How could she? Who would believe her? David knelt at the edge of the garden, his hand brushing the soil, his brow furrowing. This is strange, he muttered, but even in the murky light of early morning, it was clear he was struggling to keep his skepticism intact. His fingers skimmed over the dirt, then paused. Lena stood behind him, rooted to the spot, watching with a growing sense of dread. The soil had settled, but the ground felt different. The air was thick with that same musty scent, and for the first time, Lena realized the plants around them had grown even more rapidly since the last time she'd seen them. The roses had sprouted new, twisted blooms, black as night. The vines had crept farther out, wrapping themselves around the garden's iron fence like serpents. The bark of the fence now cracked and splintering under their weight. Everything was moving, slowly but unmistakably. David glanced back at her, his eyes narrowing. "Lena, what did you find here?" he asked, his voice laced with a note of disbelief, but also something else. Curiosity? Fear. "I found something," she said, her voice low. "Something alive. Something that wants to escape." David's eyes shifted to the ground, where the roots snaked deeper into the earth. He looked back to Lena, a hint of unease creeping into his expression. He stood up and dusted off his knees, backing away from the garden. "We need to clear this out. It's just some old plants and roots. We can fix this. We'll pull everything out, and it'll be fine." "No," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. We can't." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, David just stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken fear. "You think it's something else?" David asked, his voice cautious, skeptical. But underneath, Lena could hear something else. It was doubt. Doubt mixed with a growing awareness that something wasn't right. Lena nodded slowly, her gaze locked on the corner of the garden. She wanted to look away. She wanted to close her eyes, to pretend none of it had happened. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop herself from seeing the vines, from feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, from hearing the whispers that seemed to grow louder each time she listened. "I'm telling you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something alive down there, and it's growing." David shook his head, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He hadn't yet come to terms with what she was saying, but he knew. Deep down, he knew. that this wasn't just some overgrown garden. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And they both knew, somewhere in the pit of their stomachs, that whatever it wasn't going to stop. Not until it had what it wanted. Lena could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. It was as though the garden was holding its breath, waiting for something. She stood at the edge of the patch, her body tense, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. The earth beneath her feet felt heavy, like it was pressing up against her, pulling at her with unseen hands. Something was awake down there, something ancient, something hungry. David stood a few feet away, still gazing at the garden, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a long moment, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Then his eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of something. Fear, recognition, and a dawning understanding. It's not possible, Lena, he said, his voice low, filled with disbelief. There's no way a garden could do this. It's just plants. It's just dirt. Lena opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how wrong he was, but she knew. She knew deep down that the truth had already begun to settle in his bones, even if he couldn't yet bring himself to admit it. Something was happening in that garden. Something was growing, and it wasn't just roots or vines, number. It was something far more terrible, a presence. David stepped closer to her, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched tight. What do you think we should do? Dig it up? Tear it all out? His tone was still skeptical, but there was a tremor in his voice now, a crack of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Lena's eyes flicked back to the garden. The roots seemed to shimmer now, slick and dark, like a colony of serpents, coiled and slithering beneath the surface. Every movement of the soil sent a jolt of cold terror through her. And then, just as she was about to speak, a sound rose from the depths of the earth, a deep, throaty growl, as if the very ground itself was awakening, stretching and groaning in the dark. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. The air seemed to thicken around her, the scent of decay and earth growing more pungent, unbearable. The ground trembled slightly, and the sky above darkened, casting an eerie shadow over the yard. It was as though the garden was pulling in the light, consuming it, turning everything around them into a shadow. David stepped back, his face going pale, his eyes wide with shock. What the hell was that? Lena didn't answer. She didn't have to. She could feel it, the pulse beneath the ground, the tremors in the soil, the pressure building from beneath. The garden was alive, and it was coming for them. No matter what we do, she said, her voice trembling, it won't stop. Every time we try to dig it up, it comes back stronger. It's like the garden doesn't want us to leave. David's eyes darted from the writhing roots to the sky above, his hands tightening into fists. He was starting to understand. His skepticism was fading away, replaced with something far worse. Fear. We have to get out of here, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to leave. We can't stay here. Not with this. But Lena didn't move. She couldn't. She had seen it. The garden wasn't just trying to keep them there. It was trying to consume them. A screech tore through the air, shrill and unearthly. It was the sound of something breaking free. The ground cracked open with a deafening crash, and from the gaping wound, something emerged. At first, it was just a dark mass, something vast and writhing in the earth. But then, slowly, as it rose higher, Its shape began to take form. It was something enormous, something beyond comprehension, a monstrous root system, tangled and gnarled, twisting upward like a living thing, its surface slick and writhing with movement. It was as though the earth itself had been turned inside out, the roots pulling and pushing in every direction. David stumbled backward, his face drained of color. "What the hell is that?" he gasped, his voice breaking. Lena felt a chill seep deep into her bones. She had seen it before, beneath the earth, beneath the garden. But this was different. It was no longer just an object. It was a creature, a thing of ancient malice, a twisted beast that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to wake. The tendrils reached out, moving with terrifying speed. They twisted and coiled, lashing through the air, the blackened roots slithering over the grass like serpents. And then, with a horrible snap, one of the roots wrapped itself around David's leg. Lena screamed, her voice raw, but it was too late. The root jerked, and David was yanked off his feet, pulled violently toward the opening in the ground. His hands clawed at the earth, his mouth open in a soundless scream. But the root tightened, dragging him further into the abyss. Lena stumbled forward, her body propelled by instinct, but the tendrils shot out at her, too fast. One of them whipped around her wrist, its grip like iron, and she felt herself being pulled toward the gaping hole in the earth. The ground cracked open wider, wider still, as though a giant mouth was waiting to swallow them whole. "David!" she screamed, her voice breaking as she tried to free herself. The roots tightened around her, their cold touch burning into her skin. But David was already gone. The roots had dragged him down, pulling him into the earth with a final, sickening lurch. And then, just like that, the garden fell silent again. Lena was left kneeling in the dirt, gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The roots that had ensnared her wrist loosened, as though they had done their job, their terrible purpose fulfilled. Slowly, the garden calmed. The earth closed up again, and the twisted mass that had risen from the ground was gone, as though it had never existed. Lena's hand hovered over the ground, trembling as she touched the dirt. It was still warm, still alive. She looked around the garden, her eyes wild. There was no sign of David, no sign of the creature. The ground was calm once again, but she knew it wasn't over. She could feel it. The garden was still watching, waiting, and whatever had risen from the earth, it hadn't finished yet. The sun had just begun to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains when they arrived at the clearing. 4 of them, Dylan, Sophie, Matt, and Olivia, standing on the edge of something that felt both ancient and new. They had seen the pictures. They had heard the stories. The forest with the glowing mushrooms. The ones that appeared only after dusk, casting an eerie, almost supernatural light across the forest floor. None of them really knew how to explain it, but they'd been fascinated. And when Sophie suggested a camping trip to that remote area, it seemed like the perfect idea. Sophie had always been the adventurous one. She was the one who pushed them to go further, try harder, and do the impossible. The first one to talk them into hiking that treacherous trail to the mountain peak, or to skinny dip in the frigid river in the middle of winter. Now, it was her idea again. This time, a camping trip deep into the woods, to witness something that almost felt like a secret, a piece of nature's magic, or curse, The sky above was still flushed with streaks of orange and pink as they set up camp. There were the usual sounds of the forest, the distant chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves as the wind began to pick up, but it was all tinged with something else. An odd silence seemed to hang over everything. The trees stood tall and motionless, as though they were watching, waiting. "All right," Sophie said, as she started setting up her tent with practiced ease. "We'll wait until it's dark. The mushrooms don't glow until the light starts to fade, right?" Matt, always the more skeptical one, gave her a side eye. "It's just a bunch of mushrooms, Soph. You sure you aren't getting a little carried away with all this?" "Oh, I'm sure," Sophie said, not missing a beat. "But you'll see for yourself. It's supposed to be magical. You'll see why people drive hours just to see it." Dylan, who had been unrolling the sleeping bags next to the campfire, looked up. "It's kind of creepy though, right? I mean, glowing mushrooms in the woods, in the dark. Who came up with that idea?" "Doesn't matter who came up with it," Olivia said, giving him a grin. "It's just nature, man. Let's just enjoy it." Dylan laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. He had never been much of a believer in things like magical forests. The idea of a forest that could actually glow with something other than moonlight sounded more like a tale from one of Sophie's horror movie marathons than anything remotely real. But he wasn't about to be the only one in the group not to go along with it. They had reached the heart of the forest by noon, after hours of winding roads and steep climbs. Now, as the light waned, the air around them began to take on a different tone. It was like the forest was breathing in slow, deep inhales, and every so often the wind would carry with it a strange kind of hush, like someone was listening, watching, waiting. Sophie, of course, didn't mind. She had always thrived in this kind of atmosphere, the unknown, the unexplained. It excited her, but for the others, there was something unsettling in the stillness that surrounded them. The woods didn't seem peaceful anymore. They were alive. The trees groaned in the distance, their limbs shifting as if they were stretching, almost like the forest was waking up. "I swear to God, every time I turn my head, it feels like the trees are closer," Matt muttered, casting a furtive glance at the dense thicket behind them. "Cut it out, dude," Olivia laughed. "You're starting to sound like some of those local legends. We're just in the woods. Nothing to be afraid of." Yeah, Matt said, clearly unconvinced, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. "Nothing at all." The night settled in quickly after that, the warmth of the sun slipping away like a memory, leaving behind the cool breath of evening. When the first stars appeared overhead, they knew it was time. Time for the mushrooms to show themselves. And they did. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, a soft illumination like something left on in the far reaches of the forest. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the glow grew brighter, more distinct. Faint blue-green light flickered in clusters around the base of trees, their luminescence casting long, strange shadows. The forest floor seemed alive with it. "Holy shit," Dylan breathed, staring at the growing sea of glowing mushrooms. "This is insane." Olivia, who had been ahead of the group, stopped dead in her tracks. She stood perfectly still, her breath held, her eyes wide. There was something off about the mushrooms. They didn't just glow. They pulsed. Gently, but unmistakably, they flickered like the light of a distant flame, as though breathing in the darkness. That's not normal. Matt said under his breath, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Mushrooms don't do that. They just grow. Sophie grinned. See? Told you. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Something was tugging at the back of her mind now, a faint thread of discomfort. It was like the mushrooms weren't just growing. They were moving, ever so slightly, but enough that when Sophie squatted down to get a closer look, she could swear the mushrooms were tilting toward her, reaching. Dylan followed her lead, kneeling beside her to get a better view. Are they supposed to move like this? Sophie didn't answer right away. She just stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. The glow from the mushrooms had grown brighter now, casting an unnatural light that seemed to pulse in time with the thrum of her own heartbeat. They're supposed to glow, she said softly, almost to herself. But I've never seen them like this. As they stood in the glowing field of mushrooms, a shiver passed through the group, a feeling of being watched, of being not alone, but observed by something much larger than themselves. It wasn't just the mushrooms now. The air around them felt heavier. It felt alive. Suddenly, in the distance, a sound broke the stillness, a whisper. At first, they all thought it was the wind, the rustling of branches or the shifting of leaves. But then it came again, a soft, almost inaudible voice that seemed to echo through the trees. Help us. The words were barely audible, but they carried a weight, something dark, something old. What was that? Olivia asked, her voice shaking slightly. She tried to laugh it off, but the nervous tremor in her tone made it clear that she was unsettled. Matt turned toward her, his face ashen. I heard it too. It came from over there. He pointed toward the thick trees on the far edge of the clearing. Dylan's hand shot out to stop him. Wait, we're not alone, guys. Did you feel that? It's like the forest is breathing. Sophie felt it too. It was like the earth itself was pulsing beneath her feet. She had always thought of forests as places of peace, quiet, and solitude, but this was different. This forest felt hungry, and that whisper, it hadn't been the wind. It had been something else. Okay, maybe we should head back, Sophie said, her usual bravado faltering for the first time. Maybe we've had enough. But as they turned to head back toward their camp, they realized something terrible. The path was gone. The forest, which had seemed so familiar when they'd first arrived, now looked completely different. The trees had closed in around them, their trunks twisting in ways that felt unnatural, their shadows looming like sentinels in the dim light. The mushrooms had spread, their glowing tendrils crawling up the trunks of the trees, encroaching upon their path. The trail they had come down was gone. The familiar clearing was gone, and they were trapped. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The wind had picked up in the last hour, swirling through the trees in a frenzy, but it didn't make the forest feel any less suffocating. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, as if the very earth beneath them was holding its breath. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig beneath their feet felt amplified in the thick silence. They were all aware now, aware that they had wandered too far, that something had shifted. Something was wrong with the forest. They stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, the mushrooms glowing around them like a twisted sea of neon stars. They had thought that they could simply retrace their steps, that the forest would eventually open up and lead them back to the campsite, back to the warmth of the fire. But they were wrong. There was no path. The woods seemed to close in on them, the trees growing denser, the shadows darker. Matt was the first to speak, his voice shaky, barely above a whisper. Where's the trail? It was just here. It was right here. Sophie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her instincts, usually sharp, were beginning to fail her. She scanned the trees, trying to find some landmark, some hint of the way they had come. But the landscape had shifted in ways that were impossible to explain. The trees looked different now, more like a labyrinth than a forest. Their trunks twisted and gnarled, their limbs hanging low, as though they were reaching for them. I don't know, Dylan said. He too was looking around, his face pale under the faint light of the mushrooms. This doesn't make any sense. Olivia shook her head, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. This is insane. We must have gotten turned around. We'll just find a way back. We'll backtrack, like we always do. But when she stepped forward, the forest seemed to push back. The air thickened, a heaviness pressing in on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She took another step, and then another, but the trees seemed to close in on her, the distance between them shrinking, and with each movement, the ground seemed to shift under her feet. "Stop!" Sophie hissed. She grabbed Olivia by the arm, pulling her back. "Don't move. It's not right." "What the hell is going on?" Matt snapped, his voice rising. His eyes darted nervously between the trees, his hand clenched into a fist as if ready to strike at anything that moved. Sophie was shaking her head, her mind racing. She was usually the one who kept it together, the one who found the way when others were lost, but this was different. The forest was pressing in, warping, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. She had felt it when they first stepped into the clearing, a sense of unease settling in her chest like a stone. But now it was no longer just unease. It was fear, real, palpable fear. "We need to stay calm," Dylan said, though his voice trembled. He tried to offer some semblance of authority, but even he didn't believe his own words. "We can't stay calm," Olivia replied, her voice edged with panic. "We're lost. We're in the middle of some insane thing, and I don't know how to fix it." The mushrooms around them pulsed again, their glow flickering like the heartbeat of something alive, something watching. Sophie turned toward the glowing patches on the ground, her gaze drawn to them almost against her will. There was a strange beauty to them, but that beauty was twisted, unnatural. The mushrooms didn't belong here. Nothing in this forest felt natural anymore. "I've been reading about this," Sophie said, more to herself than to the others. "These mushrooms, these bioluminescent fungi, they're not supposed to exist here. They only grow in places that..." She trailed off, her eyes widening. She had read about bioluminescent fungi before, but nothing could have prepared her for the malevolent feeling that came with these particular mushrooms. "What do you mean, places that?" Dylan asked, but Sophie didn't answer right away. "There's more to this forest than just the mushrooms," she said, her voice trembling now. "This place, it's alive. It's like the forest is a part of the mushrooms, like they're connected. This is unnatural." Matt scoffed, but there was no real conviction in his voice. "Okay, so now the forest is alive? Are we supposed to believe that? It's just a bunch of glow-in-the-dark mushrooms, Soph. That's all." But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at the mushrooms, her eyes wide as she saw something shift between them. A shadow, a figure. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The others froze. I, I don't see anything, Olivia said, her voice tight. It was there, Sophie insisted. Right there, between the mushrooms. A figure, a shadow. It moved. Matt turned, his head swiveling from side to side, but there was nothing in the dark between the mushrooms. Nothing but the odd glow. But as he stood there, his feet rooted in place, the silence began to press down on him, filling his head with a dull roar. Maybe we should just walk toward the light, Dylan said, his voice strained, his eyes wide and fearful. We've been walking in circles for too long. If we just head toward that glow. No, Sophie interrupted, her voice sharp. That's what it wants us to do. It's trying to lure us in. That's how it works. Another whisper. It was closer this time, almost tangible. Help us. The words were clearer now, as if they were spoken right next to them. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to the others, her eyes wide with terror. What was that? She demanded, her voice shaking. Something's out there, Olivia whispered, her face pale. Something's watching us. But Sophie had already begun to move. She couldn't stop herself. The forest called to her, like a siren song, beckoning her forward. She knew it was wrong. She knew it was a trap, but she couldn't help it. She stepped toward the nearest glowing patch of mushrooms. No, Sophie, Matt called out, grabbing her arm. Don't go. But the moment he touched her, something snapped. A deep, guttural sound, like the earth itself was cracking, reverberated through the forest. The trees groaned, their limbs creaking like ancient bones. And then, from behind them, something else stirred. A sound, slow, deliberate, and heavy, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice, a thick, raspy voice, as if the earth itself was speaking. The trees, the mushrooms, they were speaking. Help us. The words were all they could hear now, repeated, echoing, growing louder. Dylan turned around, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind them, the path had completely vanished, swallowed up by the trees. The mushrooms, those glowing, malevolent things, had spread across the forest floor, stretching like veins under the earth. They were trapped in the forest. It was coming for them. They had no choice but to move forward, but each step felt heavier than the last. The whispers had started again, low and insistent, like the hum of an insect buzzing just beneath the surface of their thoughts. At first, they had been distant, almost imperceptible. Now, they were inescapable, echoing from every tree, every rock, every patch of ground beneath their feet. Help us, a cry so hollow it seemed to come from the very soil itself. Dylan kept his eyes trained on Sophie, but she was no longer herself. Her movements were jerky, unsteady. She had stepped forward into the clearing without a word, and now it was as though something invisible was pulling her in deeper. She wasn't even looking at them anymore. Sophie, Sophie, Matt called, his voice tight with panic. But Sophie didn't respond. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes glazed over, her mouth slightly agape, as if she was in a trance. Her body moved with slow, deliberate steps, each one dragging her closer to the center of the clearing where the mushrooms were thickest. The glowing caps were now completely wrapped around the trunks of the trees, winding up like veins that pulsed in rhythm with her heart. Olivia shuddered and grabbed Matt's arm. We need to get her back, she said, her voice trembling. She's not herself. Something's happening to her. Dylan reached for Sophie's arm. He didn't know if he was doing it out of fear or because he genuinely felt that if he could just stop her, they'd all be okay. But when his hand brushed her skin, it was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, cold and clammy, like death itself. "Sophie, you've got to snap out of it," he shouted, but it was no use. She didn't even blink. The mushrooms, too, seemed to be pulling at her, stretching their glow like a net, casting shadows that danced in unnatural patterns. The air was thick, cloying with the scent of damp earth, and the forest around them seemed to close in even tighter, as if the trees themselves had become sentient, as if they were all part of some great, terrible organism. Matt clenched his fists. She's not hearing us," he muttered under his breath. His face had gone ghostly pale, his teeth clenched as though he were trying to hold back some primal urge to scream. But there was no way to fight this. Not this. Whatever was happening to Sophie wasn't something they could explain or understand. And then, suddenly, Olivia gasped. "Look," she shouted. Dylan's head whipped around in the direction she was pointing. At first, it was hard to see through the dense thicket of trees and glowing mushrooms. But as the light from the fungi illuminated the darkening sky, he saw it too. A shadow. It was moving among the trees, darting from one spot to another, impossibly fast, like something alive, something that was not supposed to be there. "Something's following us," Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible. His heart raced in his chest as he tried to make sense of the moving shape. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was just a shadow, almost formless, stretching and contracting like smoke or mist. But it was there, and it was moving closer. "Help us." The whisper came again, but now it was louder. It was coming from every direction, rising in a cacophony that filled their ears and clawed at their minds. It was no longer just the earth. It was the trees, the mushrooms, the air itself, a low, persistent drone of voices and breathing. The forest was alive, and it was asking for something. Sophie's steps slowed. She swayed slightly, as if the weight of the forest itself was pressing against her, holding her in place. Her face was pale, her lips moving ever so slightly, though she wasn't speaking. The words were being whispered through her, like a vessel. "We need to pull her out of it," Matt said, his voice desperate. "Now!" Dylan grabbed Sophie's arm and yanked her back, hard. But when he did, a cold jolt of energy shot through his hand, like an electric shock. Sophie's body jerked as though something had slammed into her, but she didn't react. Her eyes stayed locked on the clearing ahead, her expression fixed in a way that made it look like she wasn't seeing them at all. And then, the ground beneath them shook, not violently, but enough to make them stumble. The trees seemed to shudder in response, their trunks creaking as though they had been startled. The mushrooms, glowing like sickly stars, pulsed once, twice, each flash brighter than the last. The air grew thicker, like the whole world was being drawn into the forest's grasp. Dylan's heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. The forest wasn't just alive. It was aware of them, aware of their fear, their desperation. The force had changed them, and it was starting to consume them, piece by piece. "No more running," Sophie murmured, her voice faint, as though it wasn't really her speaking at all. "No more hiding." "What the hell are you talking about, Sophie?" Olivia demanded, her face twisted with fear. Sophie's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was not her smile. It was empty, twisted. It's all part of the plan, she whispered. It's always been the plan. Before anyone could react, the shadow moved again, this time with purpose. It darted out of the dark trees, rushing toward them at an unnatural speed. It was a blur, a wisp of dark smoke that twisted around them in a way that made their skin crawl. Then there was a flash of light. The mushrooms flared up, glowing brighter than anything they'd seen before, blinding them all for a moment. In that split second, the shadow was upon them, not a creature, not a man, but a presence, a force, a pull that seemed to suck at the very air around them. Sophie's body jerked, her eyes widening in fear, but it was too late. The forest had her. Dylan reached for her, but it was like reaching for smoke. She slipped through his fingers, her body vanishing into the darkness of the woods, swallowed whole by the shadow. What the hell is going on? Matt shouted, his voice breaking. He turned toward the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Sophie was gone. Olivia was hyperventilating now, her breaths sharp and ragged. We need to leave. We need to get out of here now. But as they turned, trying to run, trying to find the trail that they had once known, the forest had changed again. The trees were closer, their limbs reaching out like long, twisted fingers, blocking their way. We can't, Dylan said, his voice hollow. The forest won't let us, and the whispering began again. Help us. This time, it was louder, more desperate, more demanding. Help us. Help us. Help us. And as they stood there, trapped in the heart of the glowing forest, they realized one terrifying truth. They weren't just lost anymore. The forest wasn't going to let them leave. The air was suffocating now, thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had always been there, watching them. The mushrooms pulsed, their eerie glow illuminating the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees that seemed to lean in closer, as though they were listening to every breath. The forest had taken on a life of its own, its every movement, its every whisper, pushing them further into a nightmare that they couldn't escape. Matt stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He could still feel the pull, the relentless tug of the forest as it pulled at him, at all of them. But it was Sophie who had disappeared into the darkness, vanished in the blink of an eye, swallowed up by whatever was lurking beyond the trees. Where did she go? Olivia whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the whispering wind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at Matt, then Dylan, her gaze darting from one to the other, as if searching for some sort of answer, but neither of them had one. She's gone, Matt said, his voice hollow. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the spot where Sophie had stood just moments before. The forest had taken her, just like that, without a sound, without a struggle. Olivia's hands were shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself, looking around nervously, her eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. She was trying to keep herself together, but it was clear that the terror was clawing at her, inch by inch. She had always been the one to stay calm, to act as the anchor when the rest of them started to lose it. But now, she was breaking apart. What is this place? Dylan muttered, his voice a hoarse rasp. He was staring at the ground, his eyes fixed on the patches of mushrooms that had spread across the forest floor like a creeping disease. Their sickly glow seemed to taunt them, to mock them. This can't be real. No, Matt said, shaking his head. It's real. It's all real. It's not just the mushrooms. It's everything. He paused, then added, almost to himself, it's alive. The forest. It's alive. And it wants us. Olivia didn't respond, but her wide, terrified eyes locked onto Matt's. She was starting to understand what he meant. The forest was not just a collection of trees and plants anymore. It had become something far worse. Something sentient. Something ancient. Something hungry. Matt felt the tension in the air, the way the very earth beneath him seemed to pulse with something unseen. He glanced at Dylan, whose face was drawn, pale, his lips pressed tight together as though he were fighting to keep his composure. But it was clear that he was just as afraid, if not more so. His eyes flicked nervously to the mushrooms, to the shadows between the trees. And then there was that sound again, the whispering. It wasn't distant anymore. It was right next to them. It wasn't just a hum or a murmur now. It was a voice that seemed to crawl inside their heads, gnawing at their sanity. Help us. It was faint at first, like a sigh in the wind, but it was there. Help us. The words repeated, swirling around them, reverberating through the trees. It was almost as if the trees themselves were speaking, as though the very air was saturated with the echoes of something far older than the world itself. It was a voice they could feel deep in their bones, a voice that came not from the air, but from the earth. Shut up, Dylan whispered, clutching his ears, as if trying to block out the voice. But it wouldn't stop. It was inside him, inside all of them. He stumbled backward, shaking his head. We've got to get out. We've got to leave. Now. But Matt could see it now. Something was shifting in the darkness. Something that made the blood in his veins run cold. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were twisted, like the mushrooms, their bark slick and blackened, their branches stretching toward them like skeletal fingers. There was a shape moving among the trees, something tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and changing with each passing moment. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. It was something worse. And then there were eyes, dozens of them, small, glowing eyes, peering out from the cracks in the bark, from beneath the mushrooms, from the very soil itself. Olivia gasped. What is that? What's out there? Matt didn't know. He didn't care to know. He was already running. The air seemed to thicken around them, pushing back against every step, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them there, trying to trap them. The mushrooms pulsed in rhythm with the whispers, their sickly glow lighting the path in front of them. But it didn't help. Nothing helped. Every tree, every root, every blade of grass seemed to be alive now, watching them, judging them. There was no way forward. There was no way out. Keep running, Matt shouted, his voice raw. He didn't dare look back. He didn't want to see what was behind them, but he could feel it, a presence. The forest was alive, and it was chasing them, but no matter how fast they ran, no matter how many turns they made, the path didn't change. It was like they were running in circles, the same twisted trees, the same glowing mushrooms, the same eyes watching from the shadows. The forest had them. The forest knew them. The forest was hunting them. And then, in the distance, Matt saw it. The clearing where they had first set up camp. It wasn't the same clearing anymore. The mushrooms had overtaken it. The glow was brighter, more intense, like an acid burn searing the ground. The trees were closer now. Their limbs stretched so far that they seemed to be blocking out the sky. In the center of the clearing stood Sophie, She wasn't moving. She wasn't speaking. Her eyes were wide open, but they were empty. Empty. She was staring into the distance, her body stiff and unmoving, as if she were a part of the forest itself, as if she were rooted to the spot by some invisible force. "Help her," Olivia gasped, her voice hoarse. "Please help her. She's... But before she could finish her sentence, the ground beneath them trembled again. Boom. The sound was like thunder, but it wasn't the storm. It was something deeper, something older. The trees began to sway, creaking as if something had disturbed their very core. The mushrooms flickered, their light dimming and flashing, like a heartbeat that was slowing down, flickering out. And then, from the center of the clearing, Sophie turned. Her head snapped toward them, too quickly, too unnaturally, and her eyes locked onto theirs. There was no recognition in those eyes, only darkness. And then, the voice they had been hearing, spoke through her, not from the trees, not from the mushrooms, but from Sophie's mouth. "You're too late." The whisper was cold, cutting through the night like a blade. Sophie stepped forward, her movements jerky, as if her body didn't belong to her anymore. She moved toward them, her face expressionless, her eyes still empty. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a graveyard, and they were its prey. Sophie's face was still as stone. The last thing Matt saw before his world went dark were her eyes, empty, hollow. They weren't hers anymore, and yet they still stared at him with an unblinking intensity, a coldness that made his blood run cold. It was as if the forest had taken her, had taken them all, and turned them into something else, something that couldn't feel, something that could only watch. It wasn't Sophie standing in front of them anymore. It was the forest, wearing her skin. The whispering came again. "You're too late." Matt could feel his heart beating in his chest, but it sounded muffled. It was like a drum in a distance, far away. His fingers trembled at his sides, his knees weak beneath him. It wasn't just the terror that was making him feel like he was about to collapse. No, it was something else, something deeper. The forest, the mushrooms, the shadows. They were pulling him in. They were pulling all of them in. "We have to get out of here," Olivia whispered urgently, but her voice was distant, as though she, too, had begun to fade. She took a step back, but the ground beneath her feet felt wrong, soft, like it was giving way. And then Matt realized the ground was moving. He turned to look at the earth beneath them, his breath catching in his throat. The soil, once firm and solid, was rippling, as though it were alive. The mushrooms, too, were pulsating with an eerie rhythm, their glow shifting, casting jagged shadows across the forest floor. It wasn't just the forest that was alive anymore. It was the earth itself. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of dampness and rot. Every step they took seemed to sink deeper into the earth, as though the forest was swallowing them whole, piece by piece. "No, no," Olivia gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. And then, from behind them, the shadow moved. It was there. It was always there. It was close now, close enough to feel its presence pressing against their backs. The forest had eyes everywhere. It had ears. It was listening to them, waiting, just waiting for them to make the wrong move. Matt's legs were shaking, and the whispering grew louder, closer. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl, like the murmur of something inhuman. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. The shadow didn't move, but Sophie did. Her limbs jerked, as if a string had been pulled from behind, and she took a step forward. Her feet didn't touch the ground. They hovered. Her body swayed, as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. She was walking toward them, but not like herself. Her lips parted, and the voice came again. "You're too late." The voice was no longer Sophie's. It was something older, darker, a voice that resonated from the very bowels of the earth, the voice of the forest itself. Dylan's breath hitched. "Sophie, please, come back to us." His words were a desperate plea, but they held no power. The forest had already taken what it wanted. Olivia grabbed his arm. "We need to move, now." But as she spoke, Matt felt the world tilt. The ground began to tremble beneath them. The trees creaked and groaned, their limbs shaking, as if something was shifting in their depths. Something far worse than the mushrooms. Something ancient. Something that had been lying in wait. And then, from deep within the earth, came a sound. A low, guttural rumble. Thump. And again. Thump. The ground buckled beneath their feet. Roots burst from the soil, like snakes, coiling around them, pulling them down, digging into their skin. The earth was alive. The forest was feeding. Matt screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of shrieks, cries, and whispers. Olivia tried to pull him away, but the roots were too strong. They wrapped around their ankles, pulling them toward the center of the clearing, toward Sophie, toward the thing that was no longer Sophie. Sophie's eyes, those hollow eyes, fixed on Matt, and then silence. The forest held its breath. It was too late. The path was gone. There was no escape. Sophie, or what had once been Sophie, opened her mouth, and the voice came again. Louder now, not just through her, but through the trees, through the ground, through the very air. "You are part of it now." And just as the darkness seemed to swallow him, Matt understood. It wasn't the mushrooms, it wasn't the trees. It was the forest itself, a living, breathing organism that fed on souls, that twisted and contorted the world around it until there was nothing left but the whispers and the shadows. It wasn't the forest that had been waiting for them. It was the forest that was them. They were part of it now. The roots, the mushrooms, the earth itself. They all pulsed with the same dark rhythm, as if they were one entity, connected by some ancient force, and now they were its part. Matt's screams were drowned out by the whispers, by the sound of the trees closing in, by the forest consuming him whole. And Sophie, she was already gone, and so were they all. The library was old, older than anything David had ever known. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, as though the years had forgotten to pass inside those thick, towering walls. The heavy smell of aging wood and dust hung in the air, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional shuffle of pages, or the soft creak of the ancient floorboards. David had worked at the Oakwood Library for nearly a year now, and in all that time, he had never heard anything but the usual library noises. Until now. It had started innocuously enough. Rumors whispered among the local patrons, passed on by the older generation who had been visiting the library long before David's time. They weren't anything particularly shocking at first, more like the kind of gossip that clings to old places. "You know," one of the regulars had muttered, leaning in close like a conspirator. "They say there's a burial ground beneath this place." David hadn't thought much of it. After all, Libraries were full of strange tales and legends, but this one, for some reason, had stuck in his mind. Over the following weeks, David's curiosity had begun to nibble at the edges of his thoughts. The rumors had turned into something more persistent, something that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Some said the foundation of the library had been built upon land where settlers had buried their dead, an ancient burial ground that had been forgotten even by those who had lived there. They said that sometimes, if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of tapping from below, a faint, hollow sound. But when you looked, there was nothing there. The older librarian, Mrs. Whitfield, had only smiled cryptically when David had asked her about it, as if she knew more than she was willing to admit. "Old stories," she'd said, her voice slow and tired. "People make things up, especially in a town like this." But there was something in her tone, a weight of unspoken knowledge that made David uneasy. He didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way she had paused for just a beat too long before continuing. But David began to wonder if there was more to the rumors than simple folklore. It wasn't just the stories that had unsettled him. It was the library itself. The deeper into the building you went, the older it seemed. The basement, for instance, was a maze of long, dim corridors, stacked with dusty old books that had never seen the light of day. The shelves here seemed to bend under the weight of time, as though the books themselves were sagging with the knowledge of years gone by. When David had first started, he had been told to stay away from the basement as much as possible, some sort of "don't ask, don't tell" policy from the higher-ups. No one had given him a reason, just a look, and that was enough to make him think that maybe there was something down there that no one wanted to face. It was late one evening, a few days after his conversation with Mrs. Whitfield, when David found himself alone in the library. The last patrons had trickled out hours ago, the last hum of conversation fading into the night. Only the flickering light of the desk lamp in the front hall illuminated the space. He was preparing to leave when he heard it, a soft tapping sound. At first, it was so faint that he thought he might have imagined it, the sort of noise you dismiss as a draft or a creaky pipe. But then it came again, louder this time, from somewhere beneath the floor. It was almost like fingers rapping on wood, deliberate and methodical. David froze, his hand still gripping the handle of the heavy front door. He tried to shake it off, his mind racing with excuses. It's just the building settling, that's all. Nothing more than a draft, a shift in the pipes. But then the tapping came again, and this time it was joined by something else, a low, distant hum, barely perceptible, like the sound of a far-off train rumbling in the distance. This isn't normal, David thought, his pulse quickening. Without thinking, he turned and walked toward the back of the library, toward the staircase that led down into the basement. His feet moved on their own, as though they were being drawn by an invisible force. It was as if the tapping had a life of its own, urging him toward it. The thought of walking away, of pretending he hadn't heard it, crossed his mind for a fleeting moment. But there was something about it, something that gnawed at him, something he couldn't ignore. The stairs groaned beneath his weight as he descended into the basement. The air grew colder the further down he went, until he was shivering from the chill. The basement was just as he remembered it, dark and cavernous, filled with row upon row of forgotten books. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air, and the low light from a single bulb swayed above him like a lantern in a tomb. And then he heard it again, the tapping. Closer now, louder. It was coming from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. David's heart began to race. He took a step forward, then another, and another. The noise grew louder with each step. It was unmistakable now, the sound of something knocking from beneath the earth, a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The deeper he went, the more it seemed to pull at him, coaxing him further into the belly of the library. As he reached the far end of the basement, he spotted something that sent a chill straight down his spine. There, in the farthest corner, was a loose board. It had been there before, but David had never paid much attention to it. Now, though, the tapping seemed to be coming from directly underneath it, almost as though it were begging to be uncovered. His hands shook as he crouched down to pull the board free. It came loose with a soft creak, revealing a hole in the floor that seemed to go deeper than the rest of the basement. A dark, yawning gap that swallowed the light from his lantern. The tapping stopped, as if whatever had been knocking had sensed him. And then, for the first time, David heard something else. A low creaking sound, like something stretching. A groan from deep beneath the earth. A whisper carried on the wind. Something is down there, he thought. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. A tremor, a small one at first, then a larger one, shaking the very bones of the library. The walls seemed to groan, as though they were alive, as though they were responding to something deep below. The tapping began again, louder now, and in that moment, David understood something he had never imagined. The library wasn't just built on top of a burial ground. No, it was built upon something far older, something that had been waiting, something that was now waking up. David scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling. He could feel the cold grip of fear clawing at his chest, the sensation of something terrible pushing its way toward him. His instincts screamed for him to run, to escape, to flee, to forget what he had discovered. But there was something in that darkness, something below the floor, something that wanted to be found. And David knew, deep down, that there was no turning back now. The library wasn't just a place of books. It was a tomb, and whatever had been buried beneath it was coming. David stood frozen, staring into the yawning gap beneath the floorboards. The tremor that had rattled the walls of the basement had left him shaken, but the silence that followed felt even worse. The cold, crawling fear in the pit of his stomach was a gnawing thing, like it had always been there, waiting for him to find it. The air felt thick with something unspeakable, like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He wanted to turn and flee, but his body wouldn't obey, rooted to the spot as the trembling continued, deep within the earth. The tapping had stopped again, but David could feel it, the pulse of something just beneath the surface, waiting. The stillness was more dangerous than the noise, he realized. It was like the calm before a storm, a predator lying in wait. What the hell is down there? His mind screamed at him to turn away, to forget this madness, but there was a pull to it now, a magnetic force that kept him rooted to the basement floor. He knew what he should do: climb out, replace the board, and pretend this had never happened. But the lure of the unknown, the unexplainable, was too much. There was something about this place, about the library, that had always felt off, like it was hiding something, like it wanted to keep him there. And now, with his hand hovering just inches above the hole in the floor, the question wasn't if he should keep going, but if he could stop. He reached down into the darkness, feeling the rough edges of the hole, his fingers brushing against something cold. The pulse of dread in his veins quickened. There was something down there, something that didn't belong in a library, something far older than the town itself. A noise, a whisper, a promise of things that should remain buried. Without another thought, he grabbed the lantern from the shelf nearby, its light flickering weakly as he lowered it into the hole. The dark space beneath the floor swallowed the light instantly, as if there were no bottom, just an endless black void stretching deep into the earth. The tapping began again, softer this time, like fingernails against bone. It was closer now. Something was moving. David dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones as he leaned forward. He strained his ears, listening for anything, a sign, a clue. Was it human or something else? The noises had begun to change. The tapping was slower now, almost methodical, and then the unmistakable sound of cracking, like brittle bones breaking beneath the weight of something large, something ancient. He recoiled, his pulse racing in his ears. That was not the sound of wood settling or pipes shifting. No, this was something far darker. The creaking, groaning sound deep in the earth beneath the library began to grow louder. It was a rhythmic noise, almost like a song, a tune sung by something that had no business being here. And as the seconds passed, David could hear the unmistakable sound of something stirring, moving through the earth like a hand rising from the grave. The bones under the ground cracked again, sharper this time, like a warning. He scrambled to his feet, the lantern now swaying in his hands as his body froze in place. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the thudding of his own heart. The world felt thin, as if reality itself had begun to crack under the pressure. And then, a sudden, violent thump, a sharp bang from deep within the floorboards, louder than anything he had heard before. David stumbled backward, his legs trembling, nearly losing his balance. The light from the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging him into complete darkness. He was standing in the center of the library's basement now, only the faintest traces of moonlight filtering in through the small, high window near the ceiling. A low groan resonated from beneath his feet again, but this time it didn't come from the floor. This time it felt like it was coming from inside him. Get out now. The thought echoed in his mind, but his feet didn't move. Instead, they seemed to drag him toward the loose floorboard again, like they were being controlled by something outside himself. His hand reached down, trembling, brushing against the edges of the board. His fingers ached, a sensation like fire and ice running through his veins. And then, with a soft click, the board came free, revealing the gaping hole below. The darkness seemed to pulse with something alive, and for the briefest moment, David saw something else beneath the surface. Two glowing red eyes, faint but unmistakable, staring up at him from the pit below. A rush of fear flooded through him, cold and sharp. His instinct screamed at him to back away, to run, but his body didn't respond. The eyes in the hole blinked once, slowly, and in that instant, David understood that he was no longer in control. It was waiting for him. The tapping returned, louder now, insistent, and then the sound of bones cracking. It was growing closer. David jerked backward, his mind finally catching up with the terror flooding his body. He spun around, staggering toward the basement stairs. But when he reached the top, something stopped him. The air had shifted. The house had shifted. He could feel it. The whole library was vibrating, humming as if it was alive. The walls seemed to move around him, and the door leading back to the main level was gone. The basement door had vanished. Panic gripped him. He slammed his hand against the bare wall, searching for the doorknob. But there was nothing. Only the cold, unyielding stone of the library's foundation. He turned back toward the hole in the floor, and in the depths of that darkness, the eyes blinked again. This time, he saw something else. A figure, dark and monstrous, shifting and writhing just out of view. It was dragging itself closer, its movements slow but deliberate. David's breathing quickened, every muscle in his body screaming for him to get out, to escape this nightmare. But the walls were closing in, and the cold sweat on his skin was like a reminder of something far worse than any nightmare he'd ever had. This was real. This was here. The cracking of bones filled the air again, louder now, closer, as if something ancient and hungry was rising up from the very earth beneath him. David's mind raced for a solution, a way out, but there was none. He was trapped. The doors were sealed shut, the windows too high to reach, and the air thick with something foul. And then, in the deepest part of the basement, the ground gave way. A grotesque skeletal hand shot up from the hole, long, sharp fingers reaching for the air, and from that dark pit, something began to crawl out. David didn't wait. He ran, and as his foot hit the first step of the stairs, the scream rose in his throat, drowned out by the noise beneath him, the terrible sound of cracking bones. Avid's breath came in ragged gasps as his shoes clattered against the cold stone of the library's stairwell. His heart was a drumbeat in his ears, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sickening sound behind him. The crackling of bones, sharp and jagged, as something broke free from the earth below. The ground itself seemed to shudder, the vibrations running through his body, gnawing at his every nerve. He barely heard his own footsteps over the sound of his pounding heartbeat, but he knew something was following him. The basement door was gone. The darkness behind him had swallowed it whole. Now there was no exit, no way out. Only the weight of the earth pressing down on him. The sound of something ancient and hungry clawing its way upward, reaching for him with skeletal hands. His fingers scraped against the walls of the stairwell, his body moving of its own accord. Each step an instinctive attempt to flee. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, but the more he ran, the slower his feet felt. Don't stop. Don't look back. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when whatever that thing was had begun to emerge from the pit below. He had seen its hand, long and thin, covered in old, cracked skin, nails like claws, sharp and gleaming in the dark. And then he heard it, a rasping breath, slow, labored, like the sound of an animal choking on its own breath. It was the last thing he wanted to hear, and yet it was the one thing that filled the silence of the library's stairwell. He froze mid-step, his foot hanging in the air as his breath hitched in his throat. The noise was closer now, unmistakable, the kind of sound that made you feel like you were no longer alone in the world. It was a deep and wet sound. The air pressed through something that didn't belong in a living being. A hiss, a murmur. David snapped his head back toward the basement, his eyes wide with dread, but he couldn't see anything in the dim light. Just shadows that twisted in unnatural shapes, like they were moving, breathing, waiting. It's not real, he tried to tell himself, but the words tasted hollow in his mouth. It's just a nightmare. But the noise continued, slow, deliberate, like something dragging itself through the walls. Then the low creak of bones cracking, twisting into place, an awful chorus that seemed to echo through the bones of the house itself. David's hands tightened around the banister as he forced himself to move. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here. The upper floors were no safer, but at least there might be windows to escape from. There had to be a way out. He could feel the weight of his own panic settling in his chest like lead, his mind clouded with terror, every part of him screaming for him to run, to leave, to never look back. And yet there was the overwhelming sense that it was there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The tapping returned, but this time it wasn't just in the basement. The walls seemed to echo with it, as if the house itself had come alive, pulling him into its dark embrace. The noise was closer now, reverberating through the very floorboards beneath his feet. Was it following him? His thoughts tumbled, disjointed, a cacophony of panic and confusion. He could still hear it, the sound of something crawling, something that had no business being alive. David reached the second floor, his legs trembling beneath him as he staggered across the hallway toward the window. His fingers fumbled at the latch, but the window refused to budge. It was locked. No, sealed. And the air grew colder, a sudden chill pressing in from all sides. In that moment, a horrible realization dawned on him. There was no escape. The windows weren't just locked. They had been sealed shut. The glass blackened with something that looked like age, but something deeper, something darker. And then, through the glass, David saw it. The thing in the basement had made its way to the upper floors. Its form was now visible, its shape crawling along the walls in unnatural, sickening angles. It was rising up, slowly, deliberately. David's stomach twisted, the edges of his vision growing fuzzy, as though the world itself was beginning to distort. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The thing that had been crawling out of the pit, no longer a hand, no longer a mere shadow, was now alive. It had an upper torso, long and twisted, a thing with too many limbs, too many joints, each one snapping with a sound that mimicked cracking bone. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a grotesque mask of dried, cracked skin, pulled tightly across its skull, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. And its eyes, those eyes, were pools of endless black, staring through him like a predator that had finally found its prey. The thing turned its head, and for a moment, their gazes met. David's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his chest, choking him. The creature blinked once, slowly, and then it smiled, slowly, painfully, its mouth stretching far too wide. It was coming for him. The noise, now a symphony of cracking, of shifting bone, of tearing skin, grew louder. The walls themselves seemed to groan under the pressure of the thing's movement. The library was alive with it. The tapping had become a roar, the sound of 1,000 voices, 1,000 bodies, clawing their way up through the floor. David backed away, his breath shallow, his mind spinning. His hands trembled as he reached for anything to defend himself. A book, a chair, anything, but there was nothing. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. The basement door. It was back. It had reappeared, as if the house itself had decided to give him a way out. The door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness leaking out from the crack. Behind it, the ground seemed to tremble again, a low rumble of something far too massive to ignore. David's instinct screamed for him to run, but he knew better. Whatever waited beyond that door was worse than what was coming for him now. But his legs moved before his brain could catch up. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't think about the horror. He just ran. With every step, the cracks in the walls seemed to grow, as though the house was collapsing in on itself, pushing him toward the thing in the dark. The door to the basement opened wider with each breath, as though it had been waiting for him. And then, with one final, bone-chilling crack from the thing behind him, the door closed behind him. David didn't turn around. The basement door slammed shut behind David with a sound that echoed through the entire building, a hollow, wooden thud that reverberated in the stillness. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he staggered back into the dark room. The air here was thick, oppressive, like the weight of it pressed down on his chest, forcing the very breath from his lungs. The noise outside, the scraping, cracking, groaning, continued, louder now, as though the thing behind him had grown impatient. He wasn't sure how much longer he could outrun it. And yet, here he was, standing in the very place where it had all begun. The basement seemed unchanged. The faint glow of the overhead light flickered overhead, casting weak shadows on the far walls. The shelves of forgotten books lined the room, dusty and untouched, as though they had not been disturbed in decades. But everything felt different now. The very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, a presence that David could almost feel pressing against his skin. The hole in the floor, the one he had uncovered earlier, was still there, wide and gaping, though he dared not look at it. His mind reeled with the image of those eyes, the ones that had glowed red in the dark, staring up at him with a hunger that he could not even begin to understand. It's coming, he thought. It's still here. He took a step back, his feet feeling unsteady on the cold, concrete floor. His body was trembling with fear, his mind too clouded to make sense of anything. How had the basement door appeared again? Had it been a trick of his mind, or was something else, something far older, moving the pieces around him? He didn't know. He only knew that whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The tapping sound started again. This time, it was slow, too slow, like the dragging of fingernails across an old chalkboard. It came from deeper within the earth, beneath the foundation of the library, and it was louder than before. It echoed up through the floorboards like a whisper, like a call. David could almost hear it in his bones, like a pulse, a heartbeat. It was alive. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more insistent. He spun around, eyes darting across the room, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The door had sealed behind him with a finality that made his stomach churn. It was as though the library itself had closed him in, trapping him in the very place where the thing had been buried. The ground shook again. The walls trembled beneath his feet. For a moment, David thought he could hear something breathing, low and guttural, coming from beneath the floor. But it wasn't just the ground shaking. It was as though something massive was moving, slowly, relentlessly, underneath, a terrible weight shifting through the earth. Then, suddenly, there was a sound, a scraping, a scratching, the unmistakable sound of nails dragging against wood. David froze. The room seemed to warp and shift around him, the shadows deepening in strange, unnatural ways. The walls seemed to pull in, closer and closer, until they were almost suffocating. And then he saw it, a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. He turned, heart leaping into his throat. It was there, the creature. It was no longer just a hand reaching up from the pit. No, this time it was whole, the thing that had been emerging from beneath the earth. Its body was tall, thin, impossibly long. Its limbs were twisted and elongated, the bones cracking and grinding with every movement. Its face, God, its face. It was like something out of a nightmare, a patchwork of skin stretched tightly over bone. Its eyes, those black, empty eyes, staring at him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, the flesh of its lips pulling back like it was grinning. David's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, as though his very will had been drained from him. The creature lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its body convulsing as it crawled toward him. Its limbs scraped across the floor like the sound of bones cracking under pressure, but the sound growing louder, closer. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his tongue thick with fear. He could barely think, barely breathe, as the creature moved closer and closer. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, scraping against the concrete floor with a sickening sound. David stumbled backward, his legs failing him. He fell to the ground with a thud, his hand reaching out desperately for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing but the cold, relentless floor beneath him, and the creature, drawing nearer with each passing second. The room seemed to close in on him. The walls seemed to press against him, suffocating him as the creature crawled toward him, its fingers now inches away from his face. He could smell it now, a horrible, rancid odor. Something rotting, something ancient. It was the smell of death, the smell of something that had been buried for too long. And then, just as its fingers brushed against his cheek, the ground beneath him gave way. The floor cracked, splintering with a loud snap, and David screamed as he fell. His body dropped into the darkness, the void below swallowing him whole. The light above faded into nothing, and the world became a blur of blackness and pain. He hit the ground hard, his body slamming against something cold and jagged. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his ragged breathing, echoing in the emptiness. His chest heaved, his heart hammering in his chest, but he couldn't move. He couldn't think. His mind was too clouded, too frantic. The ground beneath him was soft, like dirt. And then, just as he thought he might lose himself entirely to the darkness, he heard it again, the sound of bones cracking. David lifted his head, eyes squinting into the blackness. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. But the tapping was back, slow, steady, like the rhythm of a heartbeat, pulsing from somewhere deep within the earth, somewhere beneath the floor. The hole had swallowed him whole, and now it was calling him back. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he lay in the dark, a deep, cold nothingness pressing in on all sides. His body ached, his back, his legs, his chest. Everything felt bruised, raw, as though he had fallen into something far worse than just dirt and stone. The ground beneath him felt soft, uneven, like soil had been hastily shoveled over something buried long ago, something that should have stayed buried. But the smell, God, the smell, was the worst part. It clung to the air, thick and sour, like rot and decay. It crawled down his throat with every breath, choking him, suffocating him, until he couldn't tell where the darkness ended and the suffocating stench began. There was no light, no sound except for his own heartbeat and the low, ominous tapping from below. The tapping that had started again, the bones cracking and shifting under the weight of something moving deep within the earth. No. David tried to push himself up, his hand sliding on the wet, clinging dirt beneath him. His heart was hammering in his chest, his mind a mess of panic and fear. He had to get out. He had to escape. He couldn't stay here, but the deeper he reached into the ground, the more it seemed to pull him in. His fingers sank into the dirt, slipping as though the earth was actively trying to hold him down, to drag him further into the black abyss. Don't look down. But he couldn't help it. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his eyes fell to the floor, to the pit where he had fallen from. The hole that had swallowed him whole, the one that had been hiding something so ancient, so malevolent, that the mere sight of it made his blood run cold. And there, in the dark, something moved. A shape, long, twisted, and jerky, began to emerge from the shadows. At first, it was a blur, a sickening ripple in the blackness. But then, it became clearer. The thing that had been chasing him, crawling out of the pit, was not just a creature anymore. It had grown, its body stretching like rubber, distorting, warping into something else entirely, something more terrifying than he had ever imagined. His limbs were too long, too thin, cracked and gnarly, like tree branches twisted by time. Its fingers, no claws, were covered in filthy, dried skin that peeled away with every movement. The creature's head was too large for its body, hanging at an impossible angle, as though it had been broken and reassembled incorrectly. And its eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, were nothing more than hollow pits of blackness, black as death. It was grinning, it was smiling, and as it crawled toward him, its bony fingers clicking against the dirt floor, David realized that it wasn't trying to catch him anymore. It was toying with him, playing with him like a child plays with a bug, slow, deliberate, savoring each moment of terror it inflicted. David's breath hitched. He had to escape, but the ground beneath him wasn't just holding him down. It was alive. The walls, the dirt, the floor. All of it seemed to pulse with a rhythm, like a heartbeat. The earth was shifting, moving beneath him. The very foundation of the library was alive with the noise of cracking bones, of something waking up. The creature reached out, its claws scraping across the ground like the sound of nails dragged across a chalkboard. The smell grew stronger now, sickly, rotting, overwhelming. David couldn't stop himself. His body refused to listen to his mind's desperate pleas. "Get up! Move!" he screamed internally. But it was too late. Before he could react, the creature's long fingers closed around his wrist, its grip like iron. He screamed, his voice torn from his throat, but the sound felt distant, like it was coming from far away. The creature's face loomed over him, its grin widening until it seemed to stretch beyond what was physically possible. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping hiss that sent a shiver through David's very bones. "Welcome back." The words reverberated through his skull, crashing over him like a wave. And in that instant, David understood. It had always been here. This was not just a burial ground. It was something far older, far darker, something ancient that had been sealed beneath the earth, waiting for him, for the right time to rise again. David's mind reeled. His heart pounded in his chest as the creature dragged him closer, its breath cold on his face. He could see it now, the twisted remnants of what had once been human, the bones, the skin, all of it intertwined into something that shouldn't exist. Its body was a patchwork of old and new, of things that had been dead for centuries, and things that were still alive, writhing in agony. "It's too late," the creature whispered, its breath foul and wet against his ear. "You should have never come here. You should have never opened the door." David's eyes widened, panic surging through him as he realized the horrible truth. The door to the basement had never been sealed. It had been waiting for him to open it. The library, this place, this dark, cursed place, had chosen him. He tried to scream again, but no sound came. His body was going numb, every nerve burning with fear. He could feel the earth beneath him giving way, the ground cracking open like an ancient tomb. The library was crumbling, the very foundation of it beginning to unravel as the creature pulled him closer, its claws digging into his flesh. And then, just as he thought he might lose himself completely to the madness, the ground shook one final time. The walls cracked, the floor split. With a final, sickening snap, the library collapsed. David fell through the earth, and everything went dark. There are things that should be left untouched, unspoken. But then again, whoever listens to that quiet whisper in the back of their mind? Not many, not enough. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the decision was made. The sky hung heavy, as it often did this time of year. The kind of gray that clung to your bones and made you feel like you hadn't seen the sun in weeks. The wind howled outside, rattling the branches of the old oak tree outside the apartment, its gnarled fingers scraping the window panes like a restless ghost. But inside, the apartment felt oddly still, almost suffocatingly so. Jacob found himself pacing back and forth, an unease creeping into his chest like some lingering ache. The rain was loud against the windows, but it was the silence inside his own head that bothered him most. There was nothing on the horizon, no pressing project, no deadline looming over him like a storm cloud. The world outside felt a little too empty, a little too hollow. And when the mind gets like that, it looks for distraction. That's when he saw it, the thrift store. It wasn't as if he had never noticed it before. The small, nondescript shop had been on the corner of Oak and Main for as long as he could remember, always with the same faded sign hanging above the door. Everything must go. It was the kind of place that invited curiosity but discouraged long visits. And yet, there was something about that rainy afternoon that made the shop seem a little more inviting, a little more mysterious. On a whim, or perhaps it was the growing weight of the silence inside his apartment, Jacob grabbed his jacket, pulled on a pair of boots, and stepped out into the rain. It was the kind of store you couldn't step into without the creak of the door, sounding like an old man's bones, protesting the intrusion. The air inside smelled of dust, old paper, and something faintly musty, a smell that seemed to belong to forgotten things, the kind of store that filled you with both nostalgia and unease, the feeling that you were wandering through someone else's memories. Every aisle was filled with relics of other lives, mismatched plates, tarnished silverware, piles of old books, and furniture that seemed to have witnessed too many forgotten dinners and too many empty nights. Jacob moved slowly through the store, his hands brushing against chipped porcelain, faded upholstery, the scent of time thick in the air. There was no real purpose in his wandering, just a desire to fill the space, the silence, with something, anything. But then, like a magnetic pull, he stopped. His gaze locked onto something across the room. It was a painting, hung low on the wall, obscured partially by a stack of old picture frames. The frame was gold, worn and scratched in places, but still holding a quiet elegance. The painting itself was simple, yet impossible to ignore. It was a portrait of a man, tall, dark-haired, with sharp, angular features. The figure looked aristocratic, almost regal, but there was something off about it. His face was blank, not in the way of indifference, but in a way that made it hard to define what he was thinking. But it was his eyes. Those eyes that drew Jacob in. They were painted with incredible detail, unnervingly lifelike, and they stared at you, at him. The longer he looked, the more it seemed like the eyes shifted slightly, as though they were tracking his every movement, shifting just enough that it felt wrong. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, and an involuntary shiver ran up his spine. He couldn't look away. He wasn't sure why. For a moment, the world outside the store disappeared. The rain stopped sounding. The quiet murmur of the few other customers browsing in the back corner of the store faded to a dull hum. All that remained was the painting and those eyes. It wasn't just that the eyes moved. It was more subtle than that, more sinister. It felt as though they were searching for something in him. The odd sensation prickled under his skin. His stomach tightened, but he shook it off, laughing to himself. It's just a painting, he thought. I'm being ridiculous. But there it was again, the feeling of being watched. He could have sworn that, just for a moment, the eyes seemed to gleam with something darker, something more than just pigment on canvas. I'll take that one, Jacob found himself saying before he had fully processed the thought. His own voice startled him. The words had slipped out so easily, as if they belonged to someone else. The old woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes sharp beneath thick, half-moon glasses. She was bent over, as though gravity had pressed her down a little too hard over the years. But there was something in her gaze that made Jacob pause. She didn't smile, didn't offer pleasantries like you'd expect. Instead, her eyes lingered on him for just a moment too long, as if she was measuring him, assessing him in some strange way. Then, without saying anything, she nodded slowly, as though she had expected this. It's a peculiar one, she said, her voice rough, like gravel scraping against glass. Most people find it unsettling. I don't mind unsettling, Jacob replied, trying to sound light-hearted, though his voice felt tight, almost foreign to him. I'll take it. She didn't respond. Instead, she shuffled over to the counter, moved a few objects aside, and carefully wrapped the painting in brown paper, her hands shaking slightly as she did. Jacob felt a strange urge to leave, to walk out of the store with the painting and never look back. But somehow, the thought slipped away as quickly as it had come. The old woman handed him the wrapped bundle, her eyes not leaving his face as she did. "It's a good choice," she said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "But be careful. Things change. Not everything stays as it seems." Jacob nodded, unsure of what to make of her words. He didn't ask any questions. He simply turned and left the store, the door creaking shut behind him. The rain had stopped by the time he stepped outside, but the clouds were still heavy, like they were waiting to drop their burden at any moment. Jacob couldn't explain it, but he felt as if something had shifted. The world seemed a little off-kilter, the edges of his vision fuzzier, as if he had stepped into a place where things were no longer entirely real. He walked back to his apartment, the painting in hand, though he felt the strangest reluctance to open it. The feeling that had begun in the store, the strange pull of the man's eyes, didn't let up, and it seemed to grow as he moved through the quiet streets. When he reached his apartment, he set the painting down on the floor beside the couch and stood there for a moment, simply staring at it through the paper wrapping. The unease didn't fade. It deepened, but like so many times before, he ignored it. The apartment felt quieter now, emptier somehow, as though the space itself had been waiting for him to bring the painting into it. Jacob hadn't planned on hanging the painting right away. There had been something about it, the way the eyes seemed to follow him even through the brown paper, that made him hesitate. But when he unwrapped it and stood it against the wall, his apartment felt empty. It had always been sparsely decorated, but now, in the presence of that large, imposing portrait, the room felt quieter, more expectant, as though the space had been waiting for something to arrive. He placed the painting on the floor in front of the living room wall, a stark white spot among the beige wallpaper, and considered where to hang it. The living room was small, with only one window that faced the street. There wasn't a lot of natural light in the room, and the walls were painted in dull tones that always seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. That evening, Jacob moved around the room, cleaning up the mess of old takeout containers and half-finished coffee cups. His mind kept drifting back to the portrait, the man in the picture, and his strange, unblinking eyes. At first, it was a thought that only lingered for a moment, a flicker of unease, the kind of thing that made your chest tighten slightly and left a trail of goosebumps on the back of your neck. But then, as the evening dragged on, that feeling deepened. The more Jacob tried to ignore it, the more present it became. He looked up at the painting once again. The man in the portrait still seemed to be staring at him. The eyes, those eyes, had a quality to them that was hard to define. They seemed too alive, too aware. "It's just a painting," Jacob told himself. Nothing to worry about, just a bit of overactive imagination. He hung it on the wall above the couch. Its frame, though old, fit perfectly into the space. When the portrait was in place, it dominated the room. And then, after the silence stretched long enough, Jacob felt it. The unease that had been swirling just beneath the surface crept up again. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It was undeniable. The man's eyes were watching him. It wasn't as subtle as before. There was no shift or movement. It was just that. They were there. The longer he stared at the painting, the more it seemed as though those eyes were staring back, directly at him. And it was more than just a feeling now. It was a certainty. His pulse quickened and a strange pressure began to build in his chest. The apartment, already quiet in its emptiness, felt suffocating now. Jacob could almost hear his own heartbeat thumping in his ears, as if the very air had grown heavier. He took a deep breath, and the sharp scent of paint and wood filled his lungs, a reminder that everything in this room was, in theory, still normal. The painting wasn't special. It was just a relic of someone else's life. But even as he told himself that, the feeling grew. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a nudge, a slow realization that something was subtly wrong. And then, as Jacob's gaze shifted away from the portrait, something caught his eye. The eyes of the figure. The eyes moved. It wasn't a dramatic shift, like the way a person would turn their head. It was more like the eyes settled, a little to the left, and then back again, as if they had been tracking him. Jacob froze. His blood went cold, and he felt his stomach twist into knots. "No," he muttered under his breath. He blinked, his throat tight with disbelief. The man in the portrait still appeared as calm and serene as ever, but the eyes, they had moved. He was sure of it. It's just a trick of the light. That was what he told himself. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but deep down, he knew the truth. Something wasn't right. He took a step back from the painting, his legs weak under him. His pulse was hammering in his chest now, and he felt lightheaded, as if the room itself were pressing in on him. He grabbed the nearest chair and pulled it over to the wall, sinking into it, not taking his eyes off the painting. Minutes passed. The quiet, oppressive silence of the apartment stretched on, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension in his chest. Jacob stood up suddenly, as if pulled by some invisible force. He crossed the room and stood before the portrait again, peering at it closely, hoping, no, praying, that it was simply his mind playing tricks. But no, the eyes had moved again. They were fixed on him now, unblinking, unwavering. What the hell is this? A sharp pulse of fear lanced through him. There was no mistaking it now. The man in the painting, the figure, was watching him. His pupils were fixed, unblinking, but there was something alive about them. They seemed to be waiting, watching him with an awareness that made Jacob's skin crawl. He turned away quickly, looking down at his feet, shaking his head. It was just a painting, just a picture on the wall, nothing more. He knew that. But the longer he stood there, the more it felt like the portrait was something more, something alive. Jacob paced the room, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that gripped him, like the fingers of a hand wrapping around his throat. He tried to focus on other things, the mess of empty boxes, the old lamp that flickered in the corner. But each time his gaze strayed back to the wall, to the eyes of the painting, the feeling in his chest twisted tighter. The hours crawled by, and Jacob could feel his mind start to unravel. No matter how hard he tried to push the thought away, it lingered in his mind like a creeping vine, slowly choking out everything else. Those eyes, the way they seemed to follow his every movement, the way they seemed to know him. At some point, he collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, his mind too weary to fight the thoughts that crowded in on him. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those eyes, those unblinking eyes, staring back at him from the darkness. And when he finally drifted off, the last thing he felt before succumbing to unconsciousness was the weight of a gaze, heavy and oppressive, resting on his soul. Jacob didn't sleep that night. He tried. He really did. But sleep, as it always does when fear gnaws at the edges of your mind, refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind was flooded with images of those eyes, the eyes in the painting, watching him, unblinking, unyielding. He tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around his legs like hands reaching out from the dark. He would open his eyes to see the room around him, and every time, those eyes, those unsettling eyes, seemed to stare back at him from the wall. There was no way to escape it. No matter where he looked, no matter how many times he closed his eyes, they were there, watching, waiting. By morning, the sky had lightened only slightly, a sickly gray that matched the weight in his chest. The apartment, still silent and empty, felt colder than before. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the coffee mug on the counter, his fingers brushing the ceramic with the kind of hesitance usually reserved for fragile things. And yet, it wasn't the cold that made him feel this way. It was the feeling, the ever-present sensation of something wrong. He glanced at the wall. The painting still hung there, its presence more oppressive than before. Those eyes, they hadn't moved, not that he could see, but there was a shift in the air. The unease had deepened overnight, filling the space like a thick fog that clung to his skin and weighed on his mind. Jacob had spent years alone in this small apartment, but this was different. He had always liked the solitude before, the quiet, but now the silence felt deafening, oppressive, like a constant, unseen weight pressing down on him. He wanted to rip the painting from the wall, throw it out into the trash, forget it existed. But he couldn't. There was something in him that couldn't. It was as though the painting had wrapped its cold fingers around his very will, refusing to let go. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his breakfast untouched, his gaze fixed on the portrait as the minutes ticked by. Every so often, his eyes would dart to the corner of the room, as though he expected to see the eyes of the man move again. But no, the figure in the painting remained frozen, calm, serene. Yet the longer he looked at it, the more the weight of those eyes bore into him. Around noon, he felt the urge to get out of the apartment. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the suffocating silence. Maybe it was the way the apartment seemed to close in on him, the walls growing closer with every passing hour. He grabbed his jacket, pulled on his shoes, and left. The streets outside felt like a different world. The constant hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the distant rattle of a subway train passing beneath the ground. Everything seemed so alive, so full of movement. It was like the world outside was somehow less oppressive than the one inside. Jacob walked aimlessly, hands shoved into his pockets, head down, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at him. And yet, despite the bustle of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that the painting, the eyes were still with him, following him. There was no escape from it. He wandered the streets for hours, his thoughts spiraling in circles. His legs ached from the distance, his mind running on fumes. He ended up in a small park, a patch of green tucked between a row of old brownstones. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves, and the low hum of the city seemed miles away. He found a bench near a statue of a long-forgotten hero, a man with a weathered bronze face that seemed to sneer down at anyone who dared to sit beneath it. Jacob sank onto the bench, trying to relax, trying to clear his mind. He stared at the statue, but it was no use. His mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to the painting, to the eyes. Get a grip, Jacob muttered to himself. It's just a painting. It's just a damn picture. But even as he said the words, his chest tightened. His throat felt dry, and the unease, the one he couldn't name, was back, clawing at his insides. When Jacob finally returned home, it was well past dark. The apartment was exactly as he had left it. Still, silent, suffocating. The painting still hung on the wall, its figure as calm and impassive as ever. But it wasn't the same. It had never been the same since that first moment when he'd brought it home. He stood at the door for a moment, watching the painting from the entryway. The longer he looked at it, the more it seemed to take up space in the room, expanding, spreading, pressing on everything. He felt something, a cold, creeping sensation, crawl up his spine. Without even thinking, Jacob crossed the room toward the painting. His steps felt heavy, reluctant, as though his own body was betraying him. His eyes were fixed on the figure, unable to look away. The man in the portrait, his eyes, they weren't just watching him anymore. They were waiting. Jacob's pulse quickened as he stood before the painting, feeling the weight of the man's gaze press in on him. He took a step back, suddenly afraid to be too close to it. But something, some force, held him in place. For the first time since he'd brought it home, Jacob felt something else. A presence. Not just the figure in the painting. Number. It was as though something was standing behind him, with him, in the room. Something that wasn't part of the apartment. Something older. Something far darker. Suddenly, the air grew thicker, the room colder, and Jacob felt it. A cold breath on his neck. The hairs on the back of his head stood up, and a deep, primal fear surged through him. Who are you? He whispered, his voice barely a breath. But there was no answer, only the unblinking gaze of the man in the painting. And then, the faintest sound, a soft creaking noise, as though the canvas itself was stretching, cracking. Jacob's heart stopped. The man in the painting moved. It was subtle at first. The figure didn't step out of the frame or anything dramatic. But Jacob's eyes locked onto the painting, and he saw it. The man's fingers twitched, the slightest of movements, and slowly, impossibly, the man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He could no longer move, could no longer breathe. The room, the apartment, the world around him, all of it disappeared. All that was left was the man in the portrait, those eyes, the unblinking stare, and the terrible, terrible feeling that something was about to happen, something he couldn't stop. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, each beat feeling like a drum beat in the depths of his skull. His breath was shallow, his mouth dry. The room seemed to contract around him, as if the walls themselves were closing in, squeezing tighter with every second. His hands trembled as he reached out, feeling the air grow colder, thicker, suffocating. His eyes were glued to the painting, the figure, the man, who was no longer just a portrait. Jacob's legs felt unsteady beneath him, as though the very ground had turned to jelly. He wanted to turn away, to run, but something anchored him there. Something in the eyes. Those eyes. It wasn't just a movement of the figure. It wasn't just a slight twitch of his fingers, or the curve of his lips into that mocking, horrible smile. It was something more. The painting. It wasn't just a picture anymore. It was a door. a door to something that Jaco could never have imagined. His gaze shifted downward, toward the bottom of the frame. At first, he didn't see it, but then the corner of the frame, there, just beneath the glass, moved. A slight, imperceptible shift. The wood groaned ever so faintly, and then it happened. The man in the painting began to step forward. It was so slow, so subtle that Jacob might have convinced himself it wasn't happening if he wasn't so afraid. The figure's feet lifted, just inches off the canvas, as though he was floating, as though he was being pulled out from the frame by invisible hands. The man's body leaned forward, the muscles of his chest and arms stiffening, pulling free of the confines of the frame. A scream, one born of pure terror, caught in Jacob's throat. It wasn't a sound he could control. It was instinct. His survival instincts screamed at him to run, to do anything, to get away from the thing that was now emerging from the painting. But he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, as if the air around him had solidified into chains. His body screamed for him to turn and flee, but his eyes were trapped on the figure, the man, now fully free from the painting, stepping into the real world, as though the laws of physics no longer applied. He was no longer confined to the canvas. The figure's foot landed on the floor with a soft thud. Jacob flinched, the sound echoing in his chest like the beating of a distant war drum. And then the man's gaze, those cold, lifeless eyes, shifted. No longer did they stare at Jacob's reflection in the glass. Now they fixed on him directly. It wasn't the eerie calm of the painting anymore. The eyes weren't simply cold. They were hungry, a deep, predatory hunger that made Jacob's stomach churn and his breath freeze in his throat. There was no longer any semblance of humanity in the figure's expression. He was something else now, something beyond the art, something alive. Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears. His mind raced, but it couldn't find the words. It can't be real. It can't be happening. This is just a dream. This is a nightmare. But even as the rational part of him tried to convince him of that, his eyes, his senses, screamed the truth. The figure was stepping out of the painting. He was no longer a still image. He was here, in the flesh, on the other side of the glass. The man's arm stretched out, the fingers curling into a fist, then slowly unfurling. They were long, unnaturally long, and the fingers, they looked wrong. His skin was ashen and pale, almost lifeless, as though he had been trapped in that frame for centuries, waiting to emerge. His lips parted, and Jacob could almost hear the creaking of old wood, the faintest rasp of a voice that was just beyond his reach. It didn't speak, at least not in words, but Jacob understood it all the same. It was an invitation to something dark, something terrible. He was coming for him. Jacob finally found his voice, barely. "No," he whispered, his throat raw, his voice barely more than a breath. The man, no, the thing, in the painting seemed to hear him, and it tilted its head slightly to the side, as though considering the very essence of Jacob's plea. The smile on its face deepened, a terrible, knowing smile. Jacob couldn't tear his eyes away. He couldn't look away from the horrific figure now standing just inches from him. His body was trembling, a feverish cold sweeping through him, like ice water flooding his veins. His breath came in short gasps. The air in the room was so thick now. He could taste the dampness in it, the foul, heavy air. It felt wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The figure took another step forward. Jacob stumbled back, his legs weak, His hands raced instinctively in front of him, as if to ward off whatever unearthly force was coming toward him. But it was too late. The figure was already reaching out, its hand so close, and Jacob could almost feel the chill radiating from it, could almost feel the deathly cold that had been locked away in the painting for so long. It wasn't just the air that was cold. It was as though a part of the life in the room had been stolen. The heat, the warmth, gone, sucked out of the apartment entirely. The man's fingers brushed against Jacob's skin, a cold so deep that it cut through him like ice. The sensation crawled down his spine, making his blood run cold. "No!" Jacob gasped again, trying to step back, but he could hardly move. It was as though the figure's presence was pressing down on him, holding him in place. The thing was no longer smiling. Its face had hardened, its expression changing into something darker, something ancient. The hunger in its eyes had turned into need, a need to claim him, to pull him into the depths of that painting, to take his soul as it had taken the souls of countless others who had dared to bring it into their homes. Jacob screamed, but it was a weak, broken sound. He could feel the edges of his vision blurring, his body weakening. The figure was growing stronger, more solid with every second, and Jacob could feel his own strength draining away, pulled out of him, sucked into that thing, like a moth to a flame. And then, just as quickly as the feeling of dread had come, a new sensation filled the room. Silence. A silence so thick it was suffocating. And then it spoke. A whisper. Not a word, but a promise. Soon. The figure's whisper echoed in the suffocating silence, a sound that seemed to bend time, stretching the moment, pulling everything towards some inevitable end. Soon. The word hung in the air like a thick fog, and for the briefest instant, Jacob thought he might be dreaming, but there was no mistaking it. The cold had deepened. The presence before him was real, and it was hungry. It had been watching him, waiting for this moment, for this exact moment. His body trembled uncontrollably, his limbs refusing to obey him. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to escape, but every part of him was frozen in place. His heart was pounding, a drumbeat in his chest, but his legs were useless. He felt trapped, as though the room itself had morphed into something alien, a place he couldn't understand, couldn't escape. The painting had changed everything, turned the air into a prison. The figure's eyes never left him. Jacob's breaths were shallow, his chest constricting with each passing second. He wanted to scream again, to fight against whatever malevolent force was inside the painting. But his voice was lost, choked in his throat, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere in the room. The figure's grin widened ever so slightly, as though it could sense the terror that was seeping into Jacob's very soul. And then, the figure took another step forward, its movement fluid and deliberate. It no longer hovered in the frame. It stood solid, a tangible presence now in the room. Jacob could smell it, a sour, musty scent, like old, decaying wood, like forgotten rooms sealed away for too long. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should have existed in the world outside the painting. But it was there, and it was coming for him. Jacob's mind flailed for some escape, some way out, but his eyes kept returning to the thing in front of him. The figure's gaze burned through him, cold and calculating. It knows me, Jacob thought, and in that terrible moment, he realized something far worse. It always knew me. It had been watching him, waiting for him to come home. Every movement, every passing second, every breath he'd taken had led him here, to this moment, and now there was no way out. As the figure drew closer, Jacob's legs gave way. He collapsed to the floor, his body limp, as if all strength had been drained from him. His knees hit the hardwood with a sickening thud, but even that was nothing compared to the panic that flooded his chest. His mind screamed, "This can't be real. It's just a painting. It's just a nightmare." But the painting, the figure, was real as the air around him, as real as the suffocating cold that was seeping into his bones. The man in the painting bent forward, its face now inches from Jacob's own. He could feel the icy breath that exhaled from its lips, sharp and biting, like a wind that froze everything it touched. The smile, the knowing, triumphant smile, had not left its face. "You can't run," the figure murmured, the sound a gravelly hiss in Jacob's ear. "You can't hide. I have waited for so long." The words were like a poison. Jacob's body jerked, a violent shudder racing through him as he gasped for air, but it was as if the very room was sucking the life out of him. His vision swam, the edges of his sight fading to black. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers impossibly long, curling toward Jacob's face. He could feel the coldness of it, the skin so pale, so deathly white, brushing against his cheek like a lover's touch. But it was no lover's touch. No, this was something much worse. It was the touch of death. Jacob tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. He was paralyzed, unable to move, his body locked in a vice of terror. He could hear his heart, though, thudding violently in his chest. The figure's fingers wrapped around his throat, icy cold, and he felt it. The suction. It wasn't just the figure's hand. No, it was deeper than that. It was as though something was pulling at him from within, from the depths of the painting itself, dragging him toward it, pulling his very essence out. His soul was being siphoned away. Jacob clawed at the figure's hand, his nails scratching against skin as cold and unyielding as marble. He could feel the life draining from him, feel the darkness creeping into his bones, twisting inside him. But no matter how hard he struggled, no matter how he fought, the grip didn't loosen. It only tightened. The figure's grin widened, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. There was nothing human about it now. It was nothing more than an ancient, malevolent force, a force that had been waiting for centuries, trapped within the confines of the painting, just waiting for someone like him to come along. Jacob gasped for air, but it was useless. The cold had seeped into his lungs, freezing him from the inside out. The blackness at the edges of his vision deepened, and his limbs felt heavier, as though the weight of the figure's presence had shattered his reality. "Soon," the figure whispered again, and this time Jacob heard it in his bones. "You're mine now." The last thing Jacob saw before his vision turned to pitch-black darkness was the unblinking gaze of the man in the painting. The smile, the eyes, the unrelenting hunger. And then everything went quiet.